Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the D and WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku Could Fly. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Summary. 1. For Ali's a powerful quirk, one which only the most well-honed of bodies can truly endure. So when Izuku Midoriya meets a girl who can make things float, and isn't ready to withstand 100%, it decides to go Avatar Cycle on him and unlock a different power first. Notes. Chapter 1, Prologue, Just Like Me. Chapter Text. This is the story of how I became my world's greatest hero. Ochako Uraraka watched as the plain-looking boy rocketed up past her, the wind tugging at her hair as he shot towards the 0-point robot. The force of his launch tugged free most of the debris, and let her begin to crawl free, but she continued to watch him ascend. When he first jumped, he seemed to be attempting to punch the thing, his arm back for a right hook or something, but now he seemed to be holding his arms over his head. It almost seemed like he was afraid of crashing into it, and was holding his head and face for dear life. She gasped in horror as she saw he was going to hit it, his body accelerating even faster than should have been possible, and his trajectory aimed directly at the chin of the faux villain. Her gasp turned into a small scream as he impacted, ripping into and through the beast with a small boom, the head tugging off after him and flipping backwards into the cityscape. Uraraka scrambled to a piece of broken metal, using it as a shield from the falling debris, though her thoughts remained with the plain-looking, green-haired boy. She wondered why he'd changed tactics like that, and how he'd gone faster in midair. It was almost like, no, he couldn't have, but he did. When she looked up, she saw him spinning in midair, floating like a balloon, floating like she did. Squinting up at him, she tried to see what he was doing, but only saw a general flailing of limbs and heard the hint of a scream of terror. Can he not come down? She wondered, alarmed. Crawling out of the wreckage, she tapped what might have been a leg once, and used it to float up and out of the nearby building. As she got closer, she winced at her own pain and the twinge of her stomach from lifting so much, so often. She also got a better look at the boy. His arms were bruised and probably broken, as were his shoulders, and he seemed to be screaming in horror, pain, and confusion. Hey, she called, trying to get his attention, but her queasiness growing with every second. Hey, you. He seemed to notice her, and his face gained some relief, though the pain and other emotions didn't leave. It seemed he was trying to speak, but he didn't seem to manage. It was probably from his injuries, which Ochako noticed weren't very pretty to look at. Here, grab on. He took her outstretched hand, and was tugged aboard her little contraption. Of course, now came the tricky part. I'm going to jump off now. I'm floating you with my quirk, plus you are with yours, so if I weigh you down, we'll be safe. It wasn't the most sound logic, but hey, she didn't know what else to do at this point. Besides, the boy seemed to have passed out from shock, so he couldn't argue. So, she gripped his leg tightly and carefully gave her fingertips a tap. They began to fall, along with the debris, but slower than they should have. However, it was still much faster than she expected. The sudden pressure on her head snapped her power in half, making her spew a rainbow down to the pavement and their two bodies to begin falling at the normal speed again. Oh, she'd been so stupid to try saving him. Now they'd both get hurt. Just as the thought ran through her head, a sudden gust of wind brought her attention to their much slower descent. Somehow, they'd come nearly to a stop, and were only lowering at the speed of a feather. Ochako looked up, and noticed the boy's arms flailing in the air, and his face scrunched in concentration. He was floating again. They touched down, and she helped him to the ground, at which point his quirk stopped and he slumped against the debris around them. Thank you, he mumbled, passing out. Welcome, she returned, laying her head down beside his knee. I knew I couldn't be the only one. With that, she knew no more. Chapter 2, Entrance Arc PT. 1. Not Quite All Might. Summary. How Things Progress. Notes. Chapter Text. Izuku felt dead inside, staring at the letter that had just arrived. He'd failed, of course. How could Deku ever succeed as a hero trainee, let alone All Might's apprentice? Hopefully, he'd be able to give back one for all without much trouble, if that was what he'd received. He'd never even heard of All Might floating like he had, and the muscle-bound hero hadn't mentioned it. Maybe he hadn't trusted him after all. Maybe all the work was just to get him into shape as a potential candidate for a good policeman, and an easier way to let him down after what he'd been through. Maybe it had all been an act of pity. Whatever he saw in me, it didn't come out, anyways. With that horrible thought, Izuku slipped open the letter and removed the page, not noticing the weight within the envelope. The first page was blank, aside from a small UA logo, and the words, remove after watching. Watching? Izuku asked the room at large, confused. Then he noticed the small black disc inside the envelope. Oh, he placed what he now realized was a holocap onto the desk, and flipped it right side up. This is a projection. Izuku nearly fell out of his chair, surprised and terrified by the sudden shout. All Might. Why, I thought this was from UA. He looked down at his hands, and then back up to the image of his mentor and idol. The number one hero grinned and bowed slightly, and began to speak in his normal, booming voice. It's been some time, young Midoriya. We, the staff of UA, have been deliberating extensively, and now we are ready to announce the results. Apologies for our lateness. He bowed again, and Izuku leaned in a little closer, in awe at the idea of All Might teaching the next generation of heroes. While he tried to process it, All Might seemed to have a conversation with someone off-screen. But he missed the majority of it. Now, to the results. Even if you pass the written portion of the test, you earn no points on the practical. Naturally, this results in failure. There was the kicker. Izuku's heart died, and he hung his head a little, the despair dragging him back into his earlier ditch. His self-deprecating feelings began to dig into his permanent mind, when a single beam of light cut into his thoughts. But that is not the end of the story. Izuku looked up, unsure he'd heard correctly. But instead of All Might's face, he saw the round and gentle face of the girl he'd saved and in turn been saved by. Excuse me, but I'd like to see about transferring some of my points from the exam. Is that something I can do? You see, there is this really plain-looking boy. He has green, curly hair. Freckles, green eyes, I think. He could float, like I can, and he didn't get any points. I got a lot, and I want him to get some too. At least, however many he gave up to save me. He saved me, and I know I saved him back, but I can't just. She'd grown more and more emotional as her explanation wore on, but soon Mike's hand was planted on her head, stopping her mid-word. He smiled easily and nodded a little. I'm afraid we can't give him any of your points, but from what I've seen, there won't be a need for them, my little listener. The image of the pretty girl and present Mike faded away, back into All Might's grin. Your actions move those around you, no matter what powers you possess. You chose to do the right thing over your own self-interest. And that act is one no hero course can ever overlook. This is a job that places your life at risk every day, and requires conviction and dedication beyond the strength of normal people. How could we deny you, when these are traits you have in abundance? He brought a finger up in a way that indicated he had something to correct or indicate. You see, we weren't just looking for villain-based points during the exam. We also included rescue points. It is the second, and more valuable point system of the exam, which we keep secret for this very reason. Izuku Midoriya gained 70 rescue points during the exam, 55 for defeating the 0-point villain when you defended that young woman, and another 15 for saving her after her quirk failed, despite your own injuries. All Might held out his hand, almost like he wanted to lift Izuku out of his chair and into the glowing screen. Come, Midoriya, this is your Hero Academy. His eyes might have released enough water to drown the entire apartment complex, and he bowed his head in respect. He'd made it. Oh, and before I forget, I should be waiting for you at the training grounds at this very moment. If I know me, then I'm already timing you. The transmission cut off, and held up a circle that indicated the video could be replayed. But Izuku didn't see it. He was already pulling on his shoes and running for the door. I got in, Mom. I've got to go out. I'll be back soon, he said quickly, pulling on his jacket and vanishing out into the evening. His exhilaration caused him to jump off the balcony and down to the sidewalk, which he could have theoretically done before, but fear had prevented him from doing. He realized his potential danger right before he hit the concrete, and instinctively tried to brace himself and roll, only to find he'd stopped just shy of it. He started spinning, and realized he was floating again, with his feet moving up while his nose kept close to the ground. In a terrible panic, he turned off his new quirk, and crumpled against the ground. It was only a centimeter away at that point, but it was still very hard. Still, he brushed himself off and began to run, knowing exactly where he was supposed to be. All Might, he called, seeing the thin man on the sand. His mentor waved his hand slightly, indicating he shouldn't shout. Luckily, most wouldn't be walking there for dates until tomorrow, but it couldn't hurt to be careful. So, Izuku approached more quietly, though still quickly, noticing All Might had his stopwatch out and continuing to run. All Might, he gasped, leaning on his knees slightly. The skeletal man nodded and placed his hand on Izuku's shoulder, some tears in his eyes. Young Midoriya, congratulations on passing the exam. For your peace of mind, I didn't tell the school about our relationship. You got it on your own. Not really. I used your quirk to do it. The tenderness in his eyes seemed to grow stronger, and he patted Izuku's shoulder a bit before releasing him. Not quite, my young apprentice. Let's take a walk. He began to take a gentle stroll down the beach, with Izuku moving into step beside him. You've definitely noticed by now that your new quirk isn't quite how I described it. Yeah, I'm not any stronger or anything. I suspect you are, but you are correct that you aren't using one for all like I use it. The energy stored and built by the previous 8 wielders didn't come forth in power like mine does. I suspect your body knows you can't handle it yet, so instead of destroying itself with uncontrolled 100% blasts, it took up the next power in the cycle. Cycle? He asked, confused. All Might sighed and nodded to himself slowly. I didn't think I'd have to explain this to you for some time, but it seems I must. One for all is not a quirk like others in this world. It is, in fact, 2 quirks, or perhaps more. You see, when quirks first appeared, their level of diversity was far greater than that of today. While many quirks were only peripheral, like the glowing child, others carried the power of minor gods. 2 such quirks were owned by a pair of brothers, one who could steal and gift quirks he possessed, and the other who could pass on quirks he had. The former was evil, while the second was righteous. Not knowing his brother had any quirk, the first gave the latter a quirk that stockpiled energy. As it was, he only became slightly stronger, but when it merged with his own dormant quirk, they became one for all. All Might stopped and pointed at Izuku. 7 more users inherited this power, including me. We all assumed only the power of the energy and the passing itself were transferred from user to user, and thanks to my own quirkless nature, I used it exclusively. But it seems the quirks remained, in fact, fully unique in their effects. Each and every quirk from the 8 users of One for All now live within you. Your body couldn't safely use my aspect of it, and you've no reason to use the first power to pass it on yet, so it moved to the closest power that it could find, that of my predecessor and mentor, Nana Shimura. You've inherited her quirk of Float. Izuku fell to his knees, a bit stunned and amazed. Nana Shimura was one of the older heroes he knew of, but still one he admired greatly. She'd been a paragon of saving others, and struck a powerful figure when commanding the skies with her quirk. Then the full ramifications of what All Might had said hit him. Wait, will I only be able to float? Will I be stuck without your power? No, young Midoriya. I expect that as your body continues to develop, it will gain the power to handle all 8 quirks fully. You already have 2, so for now we should focus on float. 8 quirks. Well, 8 including the ability to pass them along. 7 quirks of 8 amazing heroes. 7 quirks of 7 amazing heroes. All Might added wryly. Izuku realized All Might was a little bitter about not unlocking the powers himself, or having not contributed to them, and decided to change the subject. So, how can I train float? Your power is in the physical strength, and I can't use that yet. Why, I know a few people who will be excellent aids to your training, but in the meantime, see if you can't train yourself a little. If any of your classmates have similar powers, you may want to train with them. He grinned and winked. There seemed to be one you've already met. You mean the pretty girl? Izuku asked, a little afraid of asking a girl for training and the potential time he'd be spending with her if she said yes. Quite so. From what I can see, the 2 of you will need to train your inner ears together, among other things. And, once you've gained a little more control, I can think of a pair of heroes who you would do well to train with. He shuddered and bit his thumb slightly. That is, if I can get them to listen. Izuku stood back up and bowed profusely, grateful to a level he couldn't express. Thank you, sir. You've earned it, kid. Now, let's see about getting you into shape. I might not be able to teach you about my power for a while, but we can move that date up by continuing to build your strength. If I have my way, you'll be able to use it before you graduate, and I'll have you fully trained in all of your quirks before you graduate from a sidekick. All Might inflated his body, and the 2 of them began to run, the elder hero instructing his prodige on some exercises he would need to perform daily, now that his time to work was much lower. However, Izuku's mind was beginning to wander to what he'd said about training with his classmates, specifically to the round-faced and pretty girl he'd met. I wonder if she'll agree to float with me. Chapter 3, Entrance Arc PT. 2. Evaluation. Summary. Izuku's first day. Notes. Chapter text. Izuku pulled open the door to his new homeroom. 1A, a bit tentatively. He had no doubt all of those within would be exemplary examples of noble heroes in training, but he still had a few worries. What if Kaken was in his class again? Or that business and pomp guy with the engine legs? They were kinda scary, all things being equal. But, hey, what were the chances of both of them in one class? It was like 1 in 4. Sure, he might get one of them, but there was no way he'd get both. Hopefully the nice girl with the floating quirk was there too. It would be convenient for scheduling practice if she said yes. He wasn't sure if he wanted her to agree or not. If she did, he'd be able to learn from a master of a similar power and get to talk to a girl fairly often, but that would also mean talking to a girl and spending time with her for long periods of time. His face felt warm just from the thought. As the classroom came into view, Izuku's worst fears were quickly confirmed, as both Kaken and the engine boy were within, fighting actually. He tried to slip in silently, avoiding them if at all possible, but was noticed immediately, and halted in indecision. Kaken, rather uncharacteristically, said nothing, merely turning aside and huffing. He was a little down that his old friend couldn't at least accept that he'd accomplished his goal, even if he wasn't able to be happy for him. Meanwhile, the engine boy approached him with a most official-looking gait, promptly introducing himself as Ida Tenya. Izuku shakily attempted to return the sentiment, only for another voice to interrupt his thoughts even more adamantly. The floating boy. It was the nice girl, and she was standing right behind him. She started to praise him about his actions, and to query him about various aspects of the test and himself, to which he was barely able to respond with a few muttered and incoherent words, while Izuku tried to fumble between two conversations and also get inside the class. He noticed a strange object slowly slumping up the hall towards them. By the time he was able to extricate his eyes to look again, it was simply lying prone on the floor behind the nice girl. Then it spoke. "If you're here to socialize, then get out. This is the hero course." The small cluster at the door froze up and stared at the yellow lump, which they only barely recognized as a person curled up in a sleeping bag. Then it slurped a small calorie pack and stood. From within the brightly colored sleepwear, the most worn-out hero Izuku had ever seen emerged. He stepped free and began to pack it up, before turning back to the group and the class within the room. He removed an object from within, which turned out to be a tracksuit. Izuku didn't want to know why he had been sleeping with such a thing in his bag. "Quickly now, change into your gym clothes and head out to the grounds," he grumbled, nodding at the wall, which began to open and expand with various numbered cases. "Changing rooms are on the first floor. You can figure out the rest on your own." With that, he began to wander towards the stairway. While he had a definite course and clearly knew the way, his slumping, wobbly gait could only be called a wander. It was far too slow to be anything else. Izuku looked between the other members of the queue about the door, shrugged, and went to drop off his bag. He needed to get a number and his suit. The other members of the class quickly followed suit. Some grabbed the whole case, while others opened it at their desks and removed the clothes they would need. But in only a few moments, the entire mass of new WANA students were headed for the stairway. Some of them chatted as they walked, but thanks to their instructor's opening reprimand, most simply walked in silence. In the interim, Izuku lost track of both the scary and nice people he'd already met. When the class finally emerged and lined up outside, Aizawa was already waiting for them. He was still immensely tired looking, but now had a look of impatience as well. Several members of the class shuddered. Izuku noticed, his own spine not so much chilled as well refrigerated. They all remained silent for a few moments, until Aizawa spoke. "Welcome to UA. Now that the pleasantries are over, let's get to work." He revealed a holographic screen, which listed several physical activities. Izuku recognized them as the official physical examination that was often offered to students at various grades to assess their health. Our nation, like most, still uses this test with quirks removed from consideration. Such thinking is backwards and incorrect, which means we'll be throwing out that rule today. "Back you go. Throw this ball for me." He tossed a strange softball to Kaken, and nodded his head backwards at the ring of chalk on the field. "You can do whatever you want, so long as you don't leave the circle." The grin that spread on Kaken's face was terrifying, and the ear-breaking shockwave from his toss even more so. Aizawa seemed unaffected, and merely turned his smart device around to reveal the toss distance, 705.2 meters. The level of admiration for him grew in the class, and excited tones began to rise as they spoke. "Since you all like the idea so much, I might as well tell you everything. UA is a competitive program, and only accepts the best. As such, you will be graded for your performance and given points based on your score. The student with the lowest score at the end will be ejected." The shock and horror that swept through the group was palpable. Izuku glanced around and felt his heart drop. Everyone else seemed to have excellent powers, and could likely outperform him many times over with their quirks. His wasn't good for much yet, especially not in any of these events. Maybe in the jumps, but then he wouldn't be able to get down, and that would cost him. If only he could pick the direction and float forwards or back, he'd be able to use it on the runs. Or if he could moderate it and float only a little or ease it off when he was done, he could do pull-ups, push-ups, and even the jumps with absolute ease. As it was, he doubted he could do much more than become a lost balloon at this point. Not willing to accept defeat, Izuku looked around again and used the keen detail-oriented view he used on pro heroes, rather than the pessimistic view he used to observe his equals. True, many of them had great quirks, but not all of them could be helpful in each event. The invisible girl, for one, didn't seem to have a powerful or athletic frame. Perhaps he could do well enough by being a good all-rounder. Hadn't his plan always been to enter UA quirkless? Well, now he had the musculature from All Might's training to challenge anyone here to a quirkless one-on-one. And that meant he could prove to Kaken, once and for all, that even without a quirk, he was worthy to be here. As the challenges began, Izuku warmed up the way his mentor had taught him, bouncing on his feet and stretching slightly to prepare. He needed to keep his mind clear and focused on the test, not on things that couldn't be helped. The first test was the 50-meter, which wouldn't be too much of an issue. He'd done quick running for quite a while during his training, and on varied terrain too. He was more than ready to get a new PR on. Izuku felt his stomach drop when he saw the first few quirk-powered runs devastate times that would have made a lot of professional athletes proud. He swallowed and gave his face a couple slaps to clear his head. He knew he wouldn't be in the top 15 of the class. He knew that from the beginning of his plan. He knew it. He couldn't let them get in his head. Himself, most especially. He took his position and eyed a point just past the finish line. He got the go-ahead and sprinted for all he was worth. The explosions from Kaken beside him blinded him for a brief moment. But he wasn't looking to his sides, and he didn't need to see to run. He got in a hair's breadth under 7 seconds, so narrow that most official schools would probably consider it a rounding error. But Aizawa let him keep it. He nodded at the man in thanks, and went to await the next test. Following was a check on grip strength, which he felt he performed moderately at. Not many people seemed to do well in it, aside from one student with 3 arms and another who was more muscular than seemed healthy. The following test was much worse, however. Many of the group cleared the entire distance with ease, either through augmented jumps, launches, or even simple flight. Sidesteps too showed a smattering of unattainably great and average, while he landed somewhere just above the latter. Izuku only made it slightly further than a quirkless average. His faith in his plan fluctuated slightly, but he hoped it would hold to the end. The ball toss was a real eye-opener, seeing the nice girl send the object to a supposedly infinite distance. His own toss was the best of the launches not aided by quirks, but still fell below the 3/4 line. It was also the end of his worrying. The distance run came as a blessing, as Izuku watched only a few students able to last so long with their quirks before falling behind. Some glided along with ease, certainly, but he managed to snag the 8th place rather than the bottom rung. He'd run that distance for fun during the months of training, and now he could finally show off what he was made of. He wasn't the most limber of students, and didn't outscore a single girl in the toe touch, but he led the boys. And when sit-ups rolled around, he was feeling motivated to outdo everyone. He didn't hit the top spot, but he grabbed another low number at 7. Everyone was at least winded by the time the final reveal rolled around, and Izuku was feeling confident. However, he felt his heart drop when the board again appeared, and his name wasn't present. Only 19 names were shown, with a blank spot in the 14th slot. The entire class turned to him, and then to Aizawa. These are the final rankings. Everyone but Midoriya passes. A cheer went up from some, but most simply looked confused and a little scared. The nice girl put her hand up. "Mr. Aizawa, sir, why doesn't he pass? And why is the empty spot not at the bottom?" Simple, this is where he would have scored. "But he's been disqualified." "Disqualified?" he asked, alarmed. "This was an examination of your quirk, not your physical prowess. You didn't even try to use yours once. You therefore didn't complete the test." Mutters went through the group as they checked the board and then looked to Izuku. Didn't use his quirk. Trying to show us up. No way he's that good. Serves him right. That doesn't seem fair. If you want fairness, you should have worked at a DMV. "I have to agree with Uraraka," came a voice. Everyone looked over at the 2 recommendation students, the female of which seemed to have bravery that matched her physical characteristics. Being able to complete the examination against quirk-using opponents and come out above the 3 divided by 4th line is admirable. I request he be allowed to at least explain why he didn't feel it necessary to attain a higher ranking. Aizawa rolled his eyes, but didn't object. Izuku looked at his feet and then up at the class. My quirk is a bad match for these. It lets me float. I just move upwards, and I can't slow myself down very well." "So you're saying that it would be a hindrance to all of these tests?" she asked him, making sure she understood it completely. He nodded in response. The formal-speaking girl, rather than turn back to Aizawa, looked at the floating clothes that Izuku had to assume covered someone with an invisibility quirk. "Did you use your quirk for any of the tests?" From what little posture they could see, she seemed rather taken aback at being confronted. "And no, it's just kind of always on." The proper girl turned back to their teacher. "Is she disqualified?" Aizawa sighed and shook his head. "I'm too tired for this." "Fine, you pass Midoriya. But I expect you not to rely on such excuses going forward, or I will have you ejected." Izuku felt his chest lighten considerably, but felt a little bad about whoever Minta was, who was now on the bottom. From the wails of disbelief and devastation that came from the shortest member of the class, Izuku guessed it was him. As for who's going home, Aizawa's face split into a wild and terrifying grin. It was a lie. No one's getting kicked out. The wails increased to confused choking, and the prim proper girl made a small comment about it being a logical deception. Izuku was just glad not to have failed on his first day. The class returned to the room, picking up the various forms and curriculum before being shunted between various teachers for their first day's scheduling. It was mostly a blur, meeting various top heroes who were acting quite casual as professors of more standard subjects. Had Izuku been writing down the events or recording them, They would have been too muddled to be included in an entry, probably not even worth a single panel, had he been a mangaka. Luckily, he was headed home soon, mentally and physically exhausted. Izuku wandered off campus, headed for the nearby station and hoping Kaken wouldn't bother him. Midoriya. Izuku spun in fright, and relaxed only slightly when he saw it was the bespectacled and proper Ida. A most excellent lesson, no. Aizawa-sensei truly shattered my expectations. Ida went on to outline how he'd been so easily tricked, unintentionally displaying his intensely serious personality. You two, headed to the station. Wait up, came a voice. Izuku blushed and turned to see Uraraka running up to him and Ida, immediately tensing up. Ah, Infinity Girl. I'm Ochako Uraraka. You're Tenya, Ida and Midoriya. Deku, right? Deku, MHM. That's what that angry, loud guy kept screaming at you, right? Blushing further, he looked down and tried to explain with his hands as well as his voice. Well, no, that's just Kaken being a bully. My real name's Izuku. Oh, that's too bad. Deku just kind of sounded like a you can do it kinda name. Before he could think, the words, Deku it is, slipped from his mouth. Midoriya, Ida questioned, confused and alarmed. While his new friends chattered, Izuku thought about his day and the changes that had happened in the short time of the school hours. It had been like a Copernican revolution. He'd been able to prove himself against quirks and do relatively well. Had his often derogatory nickname become some kind of term of endearment between him and a girl, and made it through his first day at UA. A thought struck him as they neared the station, and Deku tried to muddle through his difficulties speaking to Uraraka to ask her. You're Uraraka-san. Yes, Deku. Can you, He trailed off and mumbled a little. What? She asked, confused by his speaking and worried about his red face and timid demeanor. Sorry, I just meant to ask. About your quirk. Sure, what about it? Can you float yourself? Kinda like I do. Sometimes, but I don't very often. I get queasy really easy, and it's kinda rough on my body. Plus, if I did it outside it's kinda dangerous. Can't you slow yourself down? Not really. You can't either, huh? Deku shook his head, trying to work in some way to explain his inexpertise with his quirk. Well, since mine's not the greatest right now, I just wondered if you had any tips, or maybe you would know of some way we could train them together. He blushed frantically and looked away, missing Uraraka's similar red-tinted face. Oh, that sounds like an excellent idea, Midoriya. Ida interjected. But tell me, why do you need to train it outside of our classes? Surely the school will help us draw out the finer aspects of our abilities. Well, it's just that. I'm kinda not, it's not my you see, he babbled, trying to coalesce his thoughts. I'm quirkless, but got a quirk just last week. He finally blurted. Quirkless? Uraraka and Ida asked, their voices willed with confusion. Oh, or at least everyone thought I was. He rectified quickly, hoping he hadn't ruined everything. I never showed any signs of it until very recently, last week like I said. It was a big shock, and I was expecting to try getting into UA as the first quirkless student, but then it turned up like a miracle and now I'm kinda trying not to freak out because I need to learn to use it or Aizawa-sensei will kick me out. Tenya brought his arm slicing down through the air to almost literally cut through Midoriya's words, his palm halting just before his mouth. Midoriya, this is a most troubling development. I can see why you were hesitant and unable to properly word your problem. Please, forgive us for prying. And no, it's okay. I'm the one who's babbling and been useless for a lot of years. Just because you didn't have a quirk didn't make you useless, Deku. It just makes it even cooler that you could get in almost without powers. Uraraka insisted. Uraraka is correct. That's nice of you to say. Midoriya mumbled, glancing up at them and smiling sadly. His new friends watched him, their own smiles faltering as they saw how lowly he thought of himself. Tenya began to put together the causes, though Uraraka remained oblivious. I guess it makes sense to train floating myself. Uraraka mused, tapping her chin. We should ask to use the indoor gym after school some days, and figure out how, perking back up. Midoriya nodded and pulled out a fresh, pink notebook, revealing it was full of data on heroes that had flight or flotation as part of their characters. It was rather limited. Yeah, I've been reading up on similar quirks, and I think that there are some equipment options we can include once we get our outfit. Tenya nodded slightly, and remained silent. He could have contributed to the conversation, but his new friend needed the lift of his fascination. And from the brief interaction, he also needed to become more comfortable around girls, specifically the one who he would need to spend time with. As Midoriya and Uraraka began to discuss a training schedule and equipment they could requisition, and the two began to relax, Tenya felt a hint of his internal logic spiral up. He kept it inside, but he wondered at Deku's opening up to Uraraka and the obvious connection they'd begun to form. He'd never been much of a shipper, but, well, sometimes things in life fit like puzzle pieces. Maybe some people did too. Chapter 4, Entrance Arc PT. 3. The Return. Summary. Battle Trials. Notes. Chapter Text. The day after their evaluation, Izuku was in constant anticipation. He hadn't seen All Might since the beach, and he wasn't really sure how his mentor would feel about his results in Asawa's test. Izuku didn't know how to feel about it himself. He tensed unconsciously when Uraraka and Ida tapped his shoulder at lunch, and said almost nothing both in and out of class. He was excited as anything to learn under pro heroes like Mike and even the lesser-known Lunch Rush, but with his worry hanging over him, it felt a little sullied. His anxiety grew when All Might came in with his usual flair, like nothing was wrong. He barely registered that they'd be performing a mock battle until the uniforms began to emerge from the wall. That's when his embarrassment kicked in. His costume had been created by his mother, and while he loved her to bits, she'd done two things he really wished she hadn't. She'd added a pair of fairly thick bunny ears which were obvious homages to All Might's hair, additions he'd been planning to make more subtle and a little less effective as handholds for enemies. She'd also installed a parachute on the back, which was amazing, but he had no idea how to use or repack after using it. Compared to the other costumes his classmates had, he felt significantly underprepared. Uraraka and Ida had amazing arrays of armor and cushion, which would make them all kinds of deadly. Even Bakugo had a deadly-looking pair of gauntlets. All Might's surreptitious cough was enough to measure his opinion on his outfit. It made Izuku feel very small. Coughed All Might, adjusting his stance. The cleverest villains out there lurk indoors. You'll now be split into teams of 2 for our 2-on-2 indoor battles. The frog girl raised her hand and leaned forward, evidently with a question. So, no basic training. Practical experience teaches you creativity and ingenuity. All Might explained. The major difference today is that rather than destroying robots, you'll be fighting one another. A flurry of questions immediately arose in response to his announcements, and All Might was oddly slow to answer, pleading that his quirk was not super hearing. He quickly did his best to summarize the test. The white team will be the invaders, and the black team the defenders. Oftentimes, heroes have to defend various objects or people from villains on the hunt. This will be the task of the defenders. However, oftentimes villains will play the quiet game, keeping their deadly weapons and personnel under lock and key, forcing the heroes to go in after them. This will be the task of the invaders. The students grew even more excited as All Might presented them with their lottery balls and explained the rules. Izuku accepted his white ball silently, barely noticing he'd been paired with Uraraka. That was, until she poked his shoulder and he jumped in abject terror. Oh, sorry. What? Uraraka smiled, and his blush came back anyways. It looks like the gravity pair are together again. She cheered, gesturing for him to follow her. Come on, we're against Team D, and we need to plan. Leaning over her shoulder, she smiled at Ida and Bakugo, giving them a thumbs up alongside sticking her tongue at them. Ida returned the thumbs up, and Kaken did the same for her insult. Izuku just looked at his shoes. So, what's our plan, Mr. Mastermind? She asked, sitting down outside the building as they prepared to assault it. Izuku pulled out his notepad and considered. He looked back and forth between the blueprints and his datasheet on Bakugo. Uraraka evidently noticed his expression, and moved to kneel into the edge of his vision. Hey, you alive in there? Izuku sighed and nodded. Yeah, I'm not sure how we're gonna win this one. I think I can beat Kaken, maybe, but Ida's too powerful. Not to mention, I'm not really helpful in combat yet. Uraraka pumped her fists in excitement. Of course you're helpful. You know all this cool stuff, and they don't know any of our secret moves. Secret moves? He asked, a bit confused. Yeah, you're gonna make us one. Izuku considered, before smiling and attaching his mask. Yeah, I think I've got just the thing. Edging along the wall, Izuku felt the air change and dived forward, covering Uraraka as Bakugo launched around the corner, blasting the wall where they'd just been standing. Grinning grimly, Izuku stood and stared down his old friend. He trusted Uraraka to stick to the plan, and kept his back to her and his front to Kaken. You always favored a strong opener, he screamed, grabbing the gauntleted arm the next time it extended towards him. He pulled and twisted, throwing his opponent over and down to the floor. But you were always predictable. Stepping back, he straightened and spoke as calmly as he could, but keeping the conviction in his voice. Opener right hook, quick burst to close the distance if they evade. And then you get desperate and start to panic. Heavy blasts, improvisation, and sometimes you'll even risk your own health. You're a berserker at heart, and berserkers always miss against faster opponents. Bakugo took the bait, leaping and firing 2 blasts to get behind Izuku. The capture tape wasn't much, but it was enough to get his attention, nearly around his leg. The insults and the rules of the test overrid Bakugo's bloodlust, and he retreated, completely missing Uraraka and Izuku's separate retreats. He ran for the nearest window outlet, using stealth when he could, not to lose Bakugo, but to make him think he was trying to lose him. Nearing the way to the open air, Izuku paused, waiting for his rival to catch up. He had to buy Uraraka time, but he also needed to pull off a quick escape. It was time to really piss him off, and that was never a safe option. There you are, you useless Deku. You've called me that name for a long time. he whispered, counting down his estimated time in his head. It's always meant I was your useless punching bag. But someone heard that name, and they didn't think it meant that. They said it meant you can do it. That's what my Deku means now. Rounding on him, Deku placed his hand over his heart. My Deku means someone who does his best. No matter how strong you get, you'll never take that from me. The gambit worked, and Kaken leveled his arm. But he didn't unleash his top blast. Instead, he pulled a pin hidden in his gauntlet's top. Deku sized up the device in an instant, and realized his plan would work even better this way, even if it meant he wouldn't do so with very much of himself left. Dodge right, he screamed into his earpiece to Uraraka. Deku leapt at his opponent, a sudden gust of wind propelling him as he tapped into something more than just adrenaline. He grabbed the arm, the hand directly in his face, and pushed it straight up. Kaken's other arm swung to impact his now exposed form, only to catch fabric, pulling the string as he leapt. Deku had managed to extend the whole of his parachute without it having the air pressure to open, swinging the limp bundle into Kaken's face in time to dodge. The blast which emerged from his gauntlet shook the entire building, ripping the parachute up through the now cratered center of the building, and yanking Deku along with it. The force bruised his body, and he let out a scream of pain as both the pull of the item and the heat of the explosion ravaged his body. Grabbing his harness, Deku ripped it open and felt himself become weightless. He activated his quirk instinctively, praying to just stay in place. For a single instant, he stood in midair, a figure of demonic form shrouded in smoke, glaring at Ida. The armored warrior was frozen in shock for an instant too long, and by the time he managed to twist his body around to run, Uraraka had bounced off the safety of the far wall and impacted the mock bomb. Ida's overacted Nu was lost as Deku plummeted, his control too weak to keep him suspended. His parachute was expended, and his ability failing him, he reached out for an exposed piece of rebar. He managed to catch the piece, but quickly released it as his weight in the heated metal sent a shock of new pain across his arm. However, the motion did manage to send him tumbling into other floors more slowly. By the time he reached the floor above Kaken, he'd slown enough to avoid killing himself, and stared down at the pissed and disbelieving face of his bully. I didn't think you could blast that hard," he gasped out, catching the other's attention. I just wanted to get to the floor above you and tangle you up for a second, but you got me all the way up. You really are amazing, Kaken." The bully seemed to become even more confused and infuriated at that, but I knew I had to try anyway. I can't control my quirk. I've never had the powers you do. That's why I'm here. That's why I had to beat you. I had to prove I'm worth it. He didn't have any more words, or any longer before the blunt force took away his consciousness. Deku managed to wake up and prove he was alive enough to receive grading, though All Might insisted he go directly to the nurse afterwards. Uraraka and Ida were fawning over him, wondering how he was alive and praising his maneuver, but he simply smiled and shook his head. It was a move of desperation. It really wouldn't have worked if I didn't know how he thinks so well, he explained. Indeed, All Might agreed. In any other scenario, this plan would have ended in failure. In fact, the VIP of this scenario was, in fact, Ida here. A few questions were raised about why, but the clever student who'd stood up for Izuku in the other exam jumped in. While everyone was watching Midoriya outwit Bakugo's brutish attacks, Ida was preparing as a good hero should. He carefully removed all possible methods for Uraraka to defeat him, and never left his target unguarded. While Midoriya manipulated his opponent at every turn, that was no feat. Uraraka relied almost entirely on his guidance, and had Bakugo not destroyed the entire path to the top, she would have been defeated long before Izuku could have joined her. The entire class stood stunned. All Might coughed and continued on, praising her momentarily before moving on. However, while the rest of the class watched the next group begin, Izuku considered her words. He could have come up with a better plan if he'd been less focused on proving himself to All Might and Kaken. Uraraka meanwhile seemed even more defeated. She thought back and realized she was little more than a pawn. Anyone could have done what she did, even one of the medical robots. Without thinking, she followed Izuku in the stretcher, half listening to the mobile television mounted for Izuku to continue watching as he healed up. By the time they reached Recovery Girl's office, they'd already reached the third match. Sitting outside while he was treated, Uraraka wondered how she truly measured up to the others. Did she even belong at UA? Uraraka, came a soft voice. She looked up, noticing Izuku stumble out of the room, a series of bandages along the arms where he'd blocked the outer edge of the explosion. He sat next to her, wincing a little. "You all better?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, a little tired though." She smiled and prepared to leave. "You know Yaoyorozu was wrong, right?" "Huh, you weren't just a puppet or anything dumb like that," he explained. "You held off Ida by yourself, despite him being ready for you. Bakugo couldn't do that, and he won the entrance exam. Sometimes the best skill is being able to rely on someone who has a better skill than you. I knew you could get in when I needed you and stay in the game long enough to win, and that let me focus on my part. You're really awesome." Thanks. He bowed a little and Uraraka blushed. Thank you, Deku. You're pretty great yourself. The two headed back towards the main class, when Izuku paused in their discussion of how she'd fended off Ida. Wait a minute, did you need to get healed too? No, why? Well, why were you at Recovery Girl's office then? Uraraka looked away and whistled casually. Chapter 5, USJ Arc PT. 1. Dice Roll. Summary. Some brief events in the USJ. Notes. Chapter text. So, you say you've never had a quirk before the exam, yet you attempted it anyways. Such bravery and conviction. No wonder the class selected you for representative. Your difficulties have molded your personality far more than even generations of heroes could shape mine. I'm glad you got it in the end though. You seem better suited to it. Ida considered, but before he could respond, Uraraka pushed into the conversation, just as bubbly as ever. But you're still gonna be a great hero, Deku. You don't rely on your quirk like we do, and that means you don't have any bad habits to break. Izuku nodded timidly, still a little nervous around the girls. Oh, that reminds me, Ida said, snapping his fingers as he remembered, your case is quite rare, correct? How did your friends and family react to its appearance? Uraraka laid her arms across the back of the seat so she could stay in the conversation, earning a series of arm slashes from Ida for improper posture while Izuku explained. Well, my mom thought it was really cool. She thinks it's related to her quirk of attracting small objects, but more like a repulsion to the planet. I don't really have anyone else. What about Kaken over there? Interjected Sue, similarly leaning over her chair. I know he's kind of a dunce, but you gave him a cute nickname. You say that again, Froggy Girl, and I'll cook you into a soup. Yeah, Kaken doesn't like that name, especially when it spreads. I don't know how he feels about it. I was planning to talk to him after class, but after the training day with All Might he's been avoiding me, Izuku mumbled. Zero and Kaminari looked at one another, grinned, and before anyone else could say anything, started to chant Kaken. The entirety of the bus was quick to follow, including the less social students. Gyro pulled out her earplugs, looked around, and half-heartedly picked up the chant as well. It took about 3 seconds after Koda joined in with small pumps of his fists and beat with the 2 syllables for Bakugo to explode. Literally, his hand was shoved out the open window by Kirishima so the detonation merely shook their path rather than killing them all. The swerving which ensued killed the chant, but not his anger. I don't care that he grew a pair of balls alongside a new quirk. It's still an underdeveloped piece of garbage that'll never get him anywhere but a sidekick slot. Bakugo screamed, slamming his fist onto his knee in one of the open seats. I'll be the one to surpass All Might, and you can float off behind me like the dirt you are. Another, much more awkward silence followed, broken by Tsu. You've got quite the inferiority complex there, Doncha. Aizawa's restraint bandages flew from the front seat to restrain the explosive student before he went on a killing spree, and he glared back at the group. Student rep, keep order back there. Bakugo, calm down. Asui, don't antagonize him. The glare stopped the laughter building in the back, producing a final, lasting silence until they stopped in front of the USJ, with the students spreading out. Izuku and his little knot of friendlies struck up conversation again. Hey, Uraraka. Yes, Deku. When are you free to train? Kaken's right, I am behind, and I'm pretty sure you're one of the best teachers I could pick. He blushed, realizing how it sounded, and turned away. Sue looked between the flattered Uraraka and the embarrassed Izuku, and commented in her usual blunt way, you two have a really weird relationship. Your quirks are kind of similar too. Are you related? Uraraka shook her head, as did Izuku. I don't think so. You must be soulmates then, Sue remarked, walking on with Ida and saying nothing more. The two paused in their steps, watching her go and adamantly not looking at the other. They quickly walked on to catch up to the others, placing a few students between them to make sure they didn't give Tsu any more ammo for her crazy theories. Entering into the structure, the class jaws collectively dropped at the array of equipment and situation areas. This really is Universal Studios Japan, Kaminari gasped, looking over to what appeared to be a water slide on steroids. Within these walls are every disaster and accident you can imagine, came a voice from the side of the entryway, drawing every eye to it. I designed it myself and named it the Unforeseen Simulation Joint, said the voice, evidently coming from a helmeted and spacesuit-covered person, barring the bright yellow boots. It's the Space Hero, 13, squeaked Deku, jumping up and letting his quirk float him as Uraraka caught his fingers to keep him from floating away with an equal noise of unrestrained joy. I love 13, agreed Uraraka, pulling Izuku down on her other side so the two could nerd out a bit without interrupting the class not immediately nearby to them. She's the gentlewomanly hero who does her best work in rescue scenarios. Just imagine the well-mannered wisdom we'll receive. They didn't notice Aizawa and 13's muttered conversation, and by the time their attention returned to the front, it was complete. Now, before we start, I have 1 or 2 points I'd like to cover, she said, holding up the appropriate number of fingers, or 3, or 4, maybe 5. while the rest of the class seemed to wilt a little as the quick briefing started to sound like it was expanding into a lecture. Izuku and Uraraka seemed to be vibrating with anticipation at hearing the hero speak even more. Sue glanced at them and then leaned over to Takoyami, the nearest person she could see who seemed to have also noticed. "Soulmates, called it," she muttered, earning a solemn nod from the bird-headed student. "As I'm sure at least some of you are aware, my quirk is named Black Hole. It can suck in and tear anything apart. You've used it to save nearly 10,000 people from various disasters," Izuku prompted, earning a head nod from Uraraka so intense it looked like she had 3 heads all vibrating together. "Indeed," 13 said, channeling her inner Teal'c. "However, it is only because of careful training that I could do so. My quirk is much better suited to doing harm, and could easily kill if given but a moment of misplaced timing. I don't doubt some of you have similar abilities, quirk or otherwise." Holding up a finger, 13 directed their attention to the grounds, continuing to speak to the now silent and contemplative class. "In today's superhuman society, quirks are heavily monitored and restricted to ensure safety against the uncontrollable or easily destructive abilities granted at random to various people. This is a stable system, but we must always remember, one wrong move, one misplaced quirk, and people will die." The class collectively swallowed, and Deku looked down at his hands. He couldn't use a quirk which could harm others so easily, yet, but he was capable of hurting normal people with what he had. His physical prowess might not be able to handle one for all yet, but even with what he had he could probably knock someone out with a good strike. Not to mention, if he managed to get a hang of his float, he could probably drop someone, even unintentionally, and shift a heroic rescue to one of screams and very unpleasant imagery. You learned from Aizawa's training to begin implementing your power into your actions more seamlessly, now that you'll be expected to. From All Might, you learn to implement them against others with similar strength, and to see how deadly your own power is. But today you'll be learning the bread and butter of being a hero, how to save lives. I hope that by the time you leave this facility, you'll understand why you were given the gifts you have. You quirks are not meant to inflict harm, but instead, to help people around you. The impassioned speech couldn't help but inspire some clapping, and Uraraka actually cheered a little. "She's so awesome," she hissed to Izuku, earning a nod of agreement and a large grin. They were both exceptionally excited to learn how to help others with their kit. "Right," grumbled Aizawa. "Now, first things." Deku and the 2 heroes tensed, all of them glancing down at the foyer in unison as some kind of dark gas began to spiral from nowhere. "Stay close and don't move," Eraserhead screamed. "Stay with 13. Pulling out an odd set of goggles, Eraserhead stepped towards the stairs with dark intent. "What's going on? Some kind of robots like from the entrance exam?" someone asked. "Probably Kirishima." Deku shook his head, narrowing his eyes down at the mop of unruly and unexpectedly diverse figures emerging from the gaseous portal. He couldn't see many details, but the stances they held proved one thing beyond a doubt. "They're villains," he mumbled, feeling his body tense up alongside everyone else's. Not one student doubted that whoever the ruffians were, they were best described as pure evil. Even Bakugo's fury seemed inadequate to resist their aura of menace. "Villains," Kaminari laughed, denial evident in his half-smile. "There's no way. No villain would be dumb enough to invade a school for heroes." "Right, rather than indulge him." Yaoyorozu glanced to 13 with a sharp expression. "There are sensors to detect intruders into the school, aren't there?" "Of course," the hero said, stepping forward to hold the line between them and the stairs, "but none of them are going off. One of them must have a quirk to disable electronics or interrupt radio waves. Probably one of the first out. They obviously aren't so moronic as to invade without a plan then," the mixed-haired boy, Todoroki, said. "They picked a time and place away from the main campus, made sure to prevent a response, and brought a force of numbers to overwhelm unknown skill." "Doesn't matter," Eraserhead growled, gripping his scarf of capture cloth. 13. Start evacuating. Kaminari, try to get a signal out with your quirk. Maybe you can punch through another quirk's jamming. "Why, yes, sir," the electric student agreed, placing a hand to his earphone. "But-sensei," Deku protested, seeing their teacher step to the edge of the stairs. "Your style relies on hit-and-fade tactics, erasure and quick capture, against that many. And in the open, you can't possibly. No good hero is a one-trick pony," he said, quietly but firmly. Deku swallowed, feeling the words settle in his stomach. It was meant to be a reassurance, but in that moment he knew it was also a lesson. Before he could react to it though, Eraserhead leapt down the stairs, his ankle and legs prepped for a second jump halfway down the stairs. The villains at the bottom seemed to scoff and prepare to devastate him, only to appear mildly stunned as he crashed into their ranks. The first trio fell to his attacks, being smashed into one another at forces surprising for being caused by cloth and leverage. As larger and heteromorphic quirked enemies began to swarm him, he surprised the class again by actually punching them and otherwise using basic boxing and martial arts to disable and evade them. Even against so many, Deku muttered, "Odd." No time to analyze, get back to the bus, 13 yelled, gesturing the group towards the doors. Uraraka snatched Deku's hand, pulling him towards the door as his emotions began to overwhelm his better sense. He shook himself and glanced to her, nodding his thanks. She gave him a smile and released his hand, turning to face forward and hiding her cheeks from view. I'm afraid your escape would be against the wishes of my employers. An echoing voice came, emerging from the smoke which had brought the villains in, now appearing between the class and the doorway. My humblest apologies, the shadow continued. I believe introductions are in order, and my compatriots are a bit uncivilized in such matters. We are the League of Villains. Please forgive our audacious intrusion, but we have come to UA, this bastion of heroism and learning, to end the life of one All Might. You no doubt recognize him as the symbol of peace. We had it on good authority he would be present here today, but it seems his itinerary was revised. Regardless, my mission today remains unchanged, and I do again apologize for this unpleasantness. The shadow began to spike and swirl outwards, creating tendrils of darkness which spread towards the class. Before they got very far though, a pair of figures launched themselves towards it. Bakugo and Kirishima. Man, you just love the sound of your own auto-tune voice, don't ya, you discount butler? The former screamed, unleashing an explosive frontal attack. At the same time, Kirishima's sharpened arms lanced out, trying to cut through the center of the fog. The two grinned in triumph as the smoke swirled away, but died away when it reformed and began to expand again. Quite good, the shadow praised, his voice now echoing from all around them. Even though merely students, your skill is that of the best. Get back, you two, screamed 13, but it was too late. The dark smog encircled all of them, surrounding them and tearing them apart. Please, do writhe in torment until your very last breath. Everyone, came the cackling words. Without warning, Ochako found herself in midair, falling towards some water. Snapping her hands together, she felt her inertia slow and then halt, anti-gravity coming into effect on her body. Her motion sickness kicked in almost immediately, but for a moment she managed to see the whole scene of the flood zone beneath her. The two people closest to her had been sucked with her, namely the grape-haired Minda and Deku. They were falling straight for the water as well, with the purple student screaming for his life. The two struck the water, and Ochako realized there were other things in the pool with them. She almost screamed herself, seeing something very shark-like heading for the mop of familiar green hair. When he jetted past the enemy and into Minda's body, it was like he'd suddenly produced jet engines from his feet, soaring through the water before meeting his classmate. She watched a little longer as the two blasted free of the water, Deku using his ungainly floating to get them free, before glancing down at the ship below her. If she wasn't careful, she'd be in the same boat before long. Releasing herself, Ochako fell for a few seconds before reactivating her quirk and rising again at a new angle. She tried to glide down towards the deck, feeling her body fighting against her with each drop and returned to floating. By the time she'd managed to hit the surface and get her feet, Deku and Minda were already somehow on board. Holding up a finger, she threw up a little over the side, earning a disgusted whine from one of the swirling villains. She quickly wiped her mouth on a nearby deck towel and then nodded to her friend and classmate. Thank you, Midoriya, Minda grumbled, seeming similarly out of sorts. But Deku was already distracted, his eyes darting around as he muttered. They know our schedule, probably got it during the media attack. Maybe they even caused it to get the distraction in place. He noted, glancing out at the swirling villains, most of them careful to remain away from the rainbow-colored refuse. Why yeah, but All Might'll just come in and stop him, Minda protested, sitting down by the wall. We just have to wait for him. Ochako almost let herself get caught up in the optimism, but felt a thought nag at the back of her mind. But, she mumbled, if they planned this far ahead, maybe they planned on how to deal with him too. Deku nodded solemnly, his eyes flicking over to the distant melee between the land-based villains and Eraserhead. They wouldn't just come here to get beaten. Not with this level of planning. You're right, Uraraka. Besides, I don't think we could hold out that long. What do you mean? You can do your fly thing and bounce around the air, and we'll be fine. Minda protested. We can't, Deku apologized. I only just tried that out of desperation. And I can already tell I'd get exhausted with a passenger after a few minutes. Not to mention Uraraka probably can't stay up with us. Minda began to protest. And Deku shifted to muttering and thinking to himself faster than Ochako could understand, when something caught her eye. She turned and glanced at the water and felt her blood run cold. Deku, she asked quietly, I think we're running out of time. She pointed, and the two looked at the oncoming swarm of aquatic villains. They were closing in now, no longer stunned at their quick retreat. Then we'd better get going now, Deku decided, clenching his fists. If there's even a slight chance, no, even if there's no way they could kill All Might, we can't afford to sit here. It's time we prove why we're here. We have to fight. He seemed so serious, and yet his face was still so much like a teddy bear that Ochako had to restrain herself from laughing. Then he set his jaw, and the cuteness faded into unwavering resolve. She nodded and felt her own posture and aura shift to one of tense readiness. Minta began to complain and squeal in fear, but Deku ignored him. He pointed out at the swimming villains, then to Ochako and finally to himself. They brought a lot of water-based villains. They had to know what environments were here, but they sent the 2 flyers here in a place where we could easily escape. We have to assume they only know the terrain and a few things about us, not the details. That means we have an advantage. He turned to Minta. They don't know what your quirk is, and they probably only guessed about ours. We can surprise them, and if we use it well, we can get back to the group and fight with numbers. My quirk is no good here. See, Minta wailed, beginning to pull off bulbs and throw them into the water at an incredible speed. They bounced and floated along in the water, and to their amazement, seemed to worry the villains, who swam back from them. They just stick to things, or bounce off me, he groaned, continuing to throw in a panic. Minta started to scream and cry about some perverted life regrets when Ochako noticed Deku grin. Uraraka, I think I have a plan. Can you float yourself and Minta for about a minute? He asked. Ochako swallowed and nodded. Whatever you need from me, Deku, she promised. Then when I tell you to go, you go, he yelled, bracing his foot against the railing. Minta, get yourself a bounce. Minta seemed to dully recognize his words, and twisted around to start throwing balls at the wall beside them. They stuck to the material and began to pile up. Ochako touched his shoulder and then held him down by his shoes as he continued to build up a bouncing surface. A scream of rage came from behind her, and Ochako turned to see Deku flying almost straight up and yelling in a kind of imitation of Bakugo's usual yells for death. Then he stopped and fell. He twisted in midair, falling into a streamlined position with his fingers down, then abruptly vanished. A sonic boom echoed from where he'd been, shattering glass and making many of the aquatic enemies hold their ears. Go was the only echoing word Ochako could make out in the din. Ochako spun once and threw Minta at his makeshift trampoline, quickly floating herself as he rebounded and launched at her. She held out her hands and caught a hold of his as he rocketed by, tugging her free and towards safety. A deafening explosion sounded behind them, and a whirlpool formed directly below where Deku had vanished, sucking in Minta's balls and all of the villains, even tugging at the ship a little. Ochako and Minta's inertia began to fail, and they got a good view of the compacting mass of cursing limbs and foam. Another blast caught their attention, and a body rocketed up into them, knocking the pair out of the sky. Ochako screamed in pain as whatever it was hit her side, but gasped in recognition at the green-haired boy now falling beside her. She blinked at the pulverized hands he had, wondering how he'd suddenly hurt himself. Then she realized what he'd done. Deku had somehow floated with the same force he had during the entrance exam, or at least some of it, only oriented downwards instead of up. He'd blasted straight to the floor of the pool and probably tried to brace himself as he'd hit it. Then he'd redirected and managed to hit them, giving them the last little push towards land. Ochako felt amazed at his ingenuity for only a moment, however, before she hit the water in the shallows and suddenly her priority became swimming. Oh gods, we're alive, screamed Minta, pulling himself free and trying to run towards Aizawa. Minta, wait, groaned Deku, trying to follow but wincing with each movement of his devastated hands. The grape-haired student actually listened, his eyes slightly enamored with Deku for some reason. We'd just get in his way, he groaned, managing to get onto his stomach and lay out his arms slightly. We need to wait for an opening. Ochako grimaced at the purple and black color of his hands and looked around for something to set them with. Then her eyes alighted on Minta. Minta, can you help me? I need your quirk, she prompted him, pulling Deku up a little more. The purple pervert nodded and offered a ball. Ochako held up Deku's hand and eased the palm onto the sphere, put his fingers down carefully. It'll help keep them in line, she mumbled, careful to keep them from touching until they were ready to be kept in place. She might not be a tactician like Deku, or have an unexpectedly versatile quirk like Minta's, but she knew how to handle hurt limbs. With luck, Recovery Girl could make him better when they got back. As Izuku managed to sit up, he noticed two things immediately. The first was that his hands felt better now they were secured. The second, that Uraraka was looking at him with a caring intensity he hadn't seen anyone but his mother observe him with before. She sighed with relief as he blinked at her, but he didn't see anything else from her as some sort of dark shape came flying down the steps and bounced to the top of the pile of unconscious bodies from Eraserhead's attacks. For a moment it almost seemed like he'd won, but in that moment Izuku's eyes found Aizawa. He was being held down by a hulking black figure, a bird-like beak but with sharpened teeth grinning above him. The other two looked over and gasped. I take it, one got away, came an arrogant drawl from the hand-covered leader. The foggy body groaned a little, and he sighed. In that case, let's bounce. Namu, break his face and we'll get out of here. The beast lifted Aizawa's head and smashed it down once more, sending a chilling sound through the cracked concrete. They're leaving. We're saved, Minta managed, rushing to hug Izuku out of joy, only to be intercepted by Uraraka, who quickly forced his head under. The enemy trio glanced over at the sound, and Uraraka's attempt to silence the boy failing as the leader turned fully towards them. Let's leave him a few dead kids though. A thank you present for failing to show up on time and die nicely. The leader cackled. He lunged at the group, and Izuku's heart stopped as the hand reached for Uraraka, none of them able to react before his fingers met her face. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the man grinned behind his hand and turned back to face the beast Namo. You're a pretty cool guy, Eraserhead, he praised, without almost any mocking. Their teacher had managed to lift his head up just enough to reactivate his quirk, freezing the attack before it could hurt Ochako. Unable to punch, Deku brought his arms to a cross in front of his face and activated his quirk full power, trying to blast the villain away from his friend. Get off her, he screamed, rocketing from the water for a deadly 1-foot impact. The hand-covered villain seemed to almost casually ask for his bodyguard to aid him. Deku impacted something hard, but felt none of the intense pain he had from his bounce off the pool floor. He looked up to see the Namu beast standing firm above him, almost completely unaffected by the impact. HM? Not bad, kid, the leader said, peering around the monster. Big hero energy with this one. I suppose one true hero kid will have to substitute 3 hero and training kids. Either way, Deku realized his impact must have released a water wave or shockwave like his previous blast uses of float, and kicked his friends back into the water. But now he was on his own. The skeletal hand stretched towards him, seeming almost unnaturally long, when a reverberating sound shook the area. Everything seemed to pause, and a deep baritone sounded through the entire facility. Fear not, I am here. Chapter 6, USJRPT 2, Preparations. Summary, getting ready for the sports festival. Notes, chapter text. Uraraka, Deku, I know you have voice to text. You better answer me, or I'll come looking for you. Don't make me bombard you with cute text smileys until I run out of texting for the month. Izuku smiled as Uraraka's texts continued to come in, flexing his stiff hands a little and wondering what he could possibly say to his friend. She was probably worried out of her mind, especially after seeing how damaged his hands were. His mother certainly had been, wiggling his digits a bit, and glad he had the day off from school so they could just relax and recover. Izuku typed out a short message back. You, please, no, spare me, I submit. He saw the little bubble appear almost instantly, and felt a pang of sorrow. She'd been so desperate to hear from him, she was already replying. He wondered if he'd just worried her that much, or if she was just bored. Uraraka, very well, I shall spare you. Deku, in exchange for my grace, you now owe me Machai, and the promise you'll never hurt yourself like that again, so help me. Izuku felt a little laugh bubble up, and decided to keep playing along. It was nice to have a friend who could tease him and still be nice. Yes, your majesty. Will lunch rushes, Machai ball dessert be enough to satisfy your wrath? Uraraka, only because I like you. If you were anyone else, I'd make you pay for more expensive stuff. Well, maybe Ida could get away with it too, but he doesn't count. You two are my besties. Clutching at his heart, Izuku felt his chest tighten in emotion. She thought he was her bestie. This was in the top 5 happiest days of his life. You mean it, Uraraka. Of course, I wouldn't make Ida pay for expensive Machai, mostly because he'd do it without thinking. I mean, us being besties. I've never had best friends before. There was a discernible pause in the texts, only because Uraraka had been so quick up until now, and Izuku worried he'd gone too far and somehow driven her off. He relaxed when the 3 dots reappeared, and her text resumed with normal speed. Uraraka, if you wanna be, you're like super cool, and Ida's really fun. Plus, we're floaty buddies, remember? Gotta watch out for each other. Always. Probably should work on the name though. Uraraka, Hover Pals, Sky Guys, Twin Stars, Gravity Brigade, Flybys, Super Rabbit in the Pink Marshmallow. What was that last? Uraraka, I mean, didn't you know? Your cute bunny ears on your costume. Blushing furiously at the idea that Uraraka found him cute when he was wearing his old gear, Izuku felt a small pang that it had been more or less destroyed. Hopefully they'd keep that design in mind with the beta model. Yeah, I guess so. But that's not a really flattering name for you. You should be, like, Gravity Girl, or Ultra Uraraka, something that shows off how cool you are. Uraraka, I'm not that cool. Besides, we aren't picking hero names. We're doing team names. Spinning in his chair a little, Izuku considered what she'd said. How could she think she wasn't cool? She was already in his top 30 heroes he'd ever put down in his notepad, and Edshot wasn't even that high. He quickly pulled over his hero journal and took a picture of the page with her sketch in the center. Sent an image. You're super cool. You can even float omnidirectionally, instead of just up like I do. Uraraka's text bubble blinked for a few moments, as if she wasn't quite sure what to say, or maybe just had a lot to put down. Uraraka, wow, is that all me? I didn't know you thought I was worth the time to study like that. You're a really good drawer. You could be an artist hero, if you got the right support gear. Wait a minute, that's not my costume in the bottom corner. It looks awesome. Is it like an upgrade? She continued sending little messages like that for a while, asking questions and praising his analysis. Izuku wondered if he was blushing enough to heat the rice his mother was no doubt cooking in the room over. His pondering was cut short when Uraraka sent him a question he hadn't considered before. Uraraka, is there a Deku page? For the first time in his life, Izuku thought about analyzing himself. Why shouldn't he? He'd be a hero too in a few years, and he couldn't just brute strength his way through. He didn't even know what kinds of support gear he might need yet, since he no longer required a parachute. It had to be corrected. Pulling over a fresh notepad, he labeled it Deku 1 and flipped to the first page to begin sketching what he lovingly nicknamed Alpha Costume. He started describing his battle with Kaken, his fight with the 0-point robot, and the events at the USJ, trying to be as objective as possible. He paused, realizing he was too involved. No matter what he thought of, he was too close to the action. He needed his friends. You, can I call you? He was answered by his phone ringing almost immediately. He gulped and hit the answer call icon. Texting his best friend was one thing, but calling a girl in his room. Machai machai, Uraraka sang, as soon as he put his ear to the receiver. At once, all of Izuku's tension left and he choked out a laugh. Of course, despite everything, she was still Uraraka. What's up, Deku? She asked, a bit cheekily as he recovered. Sorry, it was just. That's a very Uraraka way to answer the phone. Uraraka, he apologized, flipping a page and setting down his pencil. I never thought about making a page on myself. I was just trying to, but I realized I'm not exactly sure how I did. If it's not a lot of trouble, could you tell me what you remember about the times I used my quirk around you? Uraraka was silent for a moment, but when she answered, her voice was as chipper and bright as ever. Sure thing, Deku. It's always nice to help friends. Oh, you should call Ida and Minta. They were there too. And what about that grumpy cat Chan? Trying to put aside the image of Bakugo as a house cat, Izuku nodded and wrote down her suggestion. She was so insightful sometimes, and he wondered if he just overthought things or if she was just gifted at seeing the bigger picture sometimes. I think Kaken's angry with me. Maybe later. But I'll call Ida and Minta after you. That's a good idea. But first things first, what do you want to know? She asked, her tone shifting to one of curiosity. Well, I know this isn't really helpful, but can you tell me what it looked like I was doing? Was I being too hesitant, or? He shrugged, before realizing she couldn't see him. I don't know, I just know I'm missing the bigger picture. The sounds of deep pondering came from the other end of the line, and Izuku took a moment to get more comfortable in his chair. Well, you seemed really bruised up when you hit stuff, Uraraka mused, and he could almost imagine her tapping her chin, like when you hit that big robot, or the bottom of the pool. I remember when I was figuring out my costume, I figured I would fall sometimes, so I had my boots made for soft landing. Her humming came again, and Izuku found it oddly comforting as he wrote down her ideas. When we fought Ida and Angry Boy, you were really well prepared, and you used your parachute really well. You predicted him super well, and you were confident. It was super cool to hear you predict all the stuff that would happen and then see it happen exactly how you said. It was kind of amazing. He didn't know when he'd started blushing, nor when he'd started to tear up at being praised. For some reason, he didn't really mind it at the moment. But at the USJ it was all different. She quickly moved on. You were using that new power and stuff. All the bouncy jetty stuff, you know. It was super cool how you figured out all the angles and water displacement stuff in like a few seconds. And then when Izuku heard what might have been a hint of swallowing, as if she'd caught her words and forced them down into her stomach to prevent them from being spoken. He wanted to know what she was going to say, but worried about pushing her. It was really brave when you went to hit the guy who was gonna hurt me. She finally managed, her voice suddenly very small and not very Ochako. I didn't want to see my bestie get turned to dust. He mumbled lamely. They sat in an odd silence for a while, before Izuku realized she was probably in very deep thought, and unlike him, didn't have to mutter to do so. I'll call Ida and Minta now, he offered, not wanting to interrupt her thought flow. "'Kay, see you tomorrow. Always. Yeah, see ya, Deku. Bye." She sounded oddly forlorn there, and for a moment Izuku felt like asking what was wrong. But then the line cut off, and he was left with silence. Not letting himself dwell on it, he tapped Ida's contact and put his pencil back to the page. "Midoriya, are you well? I hadn't heard anything after your injury," came his sharp voice, and Izuku could almost see his hand chopping away. "I'm all right," he admitted, feeling some of the tension leave him. "I was just wondering if you could help me with something." "Anything, my friend?" "Well, I was talking to Uraraka about some of my hero notes, and she suggested I make a page for myself. I was wondering if you could tell me what you saw when I fought you in Kaken." "Of course, such an excellent pursuit, maximizing your skills by reviewing your past actions." As it turned out, neither Ida or Minta saw very much of his quirk use or actions, and could only offer some general observations. Minda said he was too reckless, while Ida explained his actions seemed to carry tunnel vision when dealing with emotions he hadn't faced. Izuku couldn't exactly fault either of them, but didn't know if their words would help much. Still, he thanked them and went back to his notes. Based on what they told me, I'm thinking too much when I fight. Uraraka praised me when I bounced off the pool and caught them, and when I rushed the Namu thing. But I wasn't thinking too much in those moments, just acting based on what felt right. But All Might first noticed my ability to be a hero when I did just that, saving Kaken. Does that mean I need to rely more on instincts than pure knowledge? But I only beat Kaken by knowing him and sticking to a good plan. Then again, I had to improvise a bit when he started to figure me out, but I already knew his style enough to dodge on reflex. Maybe that means I should just study every potential opponent inside and out until I know them subconsciously, and then freestyle it while my body acts how it should. But that would be impossible, especially with how many secret or unidentified villains there are. I suppose experience will help, but I can't get that in a day. He blinked and realized that during his muttering he'd begun to float away from his desk, and was now sitting, cross-legged, on the ceiling. Remembering that Uraraka's floating objects tended to move upwards, probably due to the centrifugal forces apparent when gravity left, he realized he'd probably just done the same. Easing himself back down, he stopped midway and remained almost perfectly stationary between the ceiling and floor. Floating like I just was could be considered 0% my quirk was on, but I wasn't directing it, so I just floated around like Uraraka's power does to things. But what I'm doing now, directing my body to occupy a single point, or maybe just to not be pulled by the force of spin is like 1%, and when I go full power to fly at something like the enemies, I suppose that must be 100%. So, does that mean I can control how much force I put into my float? Could I fly for real at maybe 30%? Then again, I only seem to be able to move up from the orientation of my chest to my head, I think. But right now I have to be moving down as well as up to counteract gravity, yet also be stationary. Instead of trying to float towards the wall, like he would if he was going full power, Izuku tried to mimic what he was doing with the floor and imagined the wall was down. He eased himself towards it, and then away, grinning wildly. It's not much, but if I can control just this 1% of my float, that means I can learn to modulate its power to exactly what I need. Deciding to test himself a little, he tried moving between the walls like he was swimming, pushing off with a bit of force each time to build up a little speed. When he was sure his mother was going to hear him bouncing back and forth, he tried a final push, trying to float in the opposite direction to counter his speed. He slowed, but only as fast as he'd moved before, and ended up crashing face first into the wall. Izuku, are you all right in there? His mother called, worriedly. I'm okay, he called back, wondering if he was lying or not, just trying to practice floating a bit. I promise not to break anything. He heard a soft chuckle and realized the comment was unneeded. His room was filled with All Might memorabilia, and he'd never so much as bent a hair on any of the golden heads. Pushing off with force again, Izuku felt the fear of running into the wall again race through him and used it to push a little bit more out of his quirk. Maybe 3% if he was being generous, but it did the trick. He stopped dead, his limbs moving forward a little at the sudden stop. Breathing hard, he realized that while float was powerful enough to punch him through steel, it still tired him out like walking or running. Pushing his control was evidently something he'd have to work on. I can't float with intent for very long. Maybe a few minutes, and Uraraka has trouble lifting large amounts or herself. Maybe we can train our endurance together. But if we fall after running past our limits, we might get hurt. Uraraka better wear her boots since they cushion her falls. I wonder why her gloves don't have the same function. I suppose legs are better suited to cushion blows than. His leg-related thoughts were cut short as he ran out of strength and collapsed on the ground. Ouch, everyone's so excited, Deku mumbled, Ida smirking beside him. And you aren't, the bespectacled student said, waving him towards the door. Come on, let's go to lunch. Ochako was still processing Aizawa's words on why it was so important to do well at the sports festival, realizing it was truly time to begin her hero career. It was time to transform from just Ochako into something more. She had to show the world they weren't dealing with the average gravity hero anymore. She was going to rise above and become a legend which villains would fear. Deku, Ida, she whispered darkly, catching their attention. She turned to them and set her jaw, feeling herself swell with determination. What happened to your face, Uraraka? What the? You're not looking very Uraraka. Uraraka, Mina mumbled, her expression a little confused. She ignored their remarks and raised her hand in declaration. Everyone, I'm gonna crush this, she exclaimed, channeling the ambient Cat-chan and drawing out a few raised fists in those around her. She noticed Deku doing so as well, his expression a little confused but with a cute grin, and continued to pump her fist with her friends. Of course, she couldn't really stay there all day, and she was rather hungry, so she decided to transition from open statement to action. Deku-kun, she exclaimed, pointing directly at him. This week we're gonna train like no one's ever trained before and crush the competition with the power of gravity. The plain-looking boy she'd set her sights on began to look flustered and confused, but that was all part of the plan. She marched forward and grabbed his arm, tugging him towards the door. Training, she shouted, dragging Deku away with Ida in tow. Help, he whispered to the class as they exited. When she was out of the room, Ochako let her intense mood fade and giggle. She let go of Deku so he could stand up. Sorry, got a bit swept up, you know. She apologized, grinning and placing her fingers together in the way she liked to do. It's okay, he assured her, looking away and seeming just as nervous as before. Can I ask you, would you mind if why do you want to be a hero, Uraraka? Her energy wilted just a bit. She didn't really know how to state her reasons, especially when Deku's and Ida's were so selfless. I guess you could say, for the money. She trailed off. Money? Deku exclaimed, surprise etched on his face. You want to be a hero for the money? Ultimately, yeah, she muttered, itching at her head with a little shame. I'm sorry, I know it seems selfish and base, especially with your guys' really noble motivations and all. But why? There is really nothing wrong with seeking a more comfortable lifestyle. Ida interjected on her behalf. Why yeah, it's just a little unexpected, that's all. Deku mumbled, apologetically. Ochako felt her heart tingle with joy as she realized she had nothing to worry about. These were her best friends, and they wouldn't think any less of her if she'd said she wanted to be a hero for the girls, like Minda. Tears stung at her eyes, and she pulled them into a quick hug before explaining her motivations a little more. So, you can actually fly now? Ochako asked, moving her rook forward and taking a pawn. Yep, not really fast, and I'm a little better at stopping than moving. But I don't just go wherever my head's pointing at Mach 11 or just kind of drift like before, Deku confirmed, shifting his knight over to take her rook. Damn, she hissed, wondering how she'd missed his trap. Well, at least you'll be able to show that off at the festival. I have to make do with whatever they have, so depending on what's in the area, I could be out of luck. Deku smirked, stretching a little as he waited for her to make another move. There's gonna be other people there. And even if there weren't, there's always something you can work with. Unless they stick you in an empty box of concrete, anchored to the ground like nothing else, all it takes is a little ingenuity and you'll have something to work your magic on. You're so positive, Deku. Where's this confidence when you're talking about yourself? She sighed, trying to move her king out of the way. He shook his head, tapping his rook gently. Groaning, Ochako moved her piece back and let Deku flick her forehead for almost making an illegal move. Luckily, he was so timid about it she barely felt his finger brush her hair. She was going to hold back on her turns too, but since he'd yet to make a mistake like that and he'd been progressively kicking her butt for the last hour, she was reconsidering. I'm not as cool as you guys. I'm barely even able to use my quirk, but, just look around. You're already as tough as some pros. Psychic level at least. See, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You're so depressing sometimes, and all bubbly about all of us. Come on, I'm about a second away from throwing up all over the floor here, and barring this one, you've won each game for the last half hour in like 6 moves. Swallowing, Ochako tried her knight, smirking as she realized she could get a check the next move. Deku nodded, as if considering her words, before pushing his queen forward to the end of the board. Check. Ochako waited for him to answer her other comments, but quickly realized he wasn't going to on his own. That's all you have to say. Check. Deku, you can't be so self-deprecating all the time. She stood up and pointed down at him authoritatively. I don't allow anyone to bad-talk my bestie. Not even you, Deku-kun, she informed him. He blushed a little and nodded, as sorry, giving his cute apology a serious nod. Ochako sat back down and smiled normally again. Good. Now we were og. She groaned, her face shifting to despair. Check. Blog. She pushed her king out of harm's way, knowing he would just chase her the next turn. But he surprised her, chuckling and moving a pawn forward instead. Ochako didn't hesitate, and seized her chance, pushing her knight over to place his king in check. Check, Deku. She cheered, for the first time that day. Deku grinned and clapped for her, before pushing his king closer to her knight and worrying her slightly. She pulled back, returning him to check. Check again. Okay, he grinned, pushing his rook across and taking her knight. Your tactical wit sickens me, Ochako groaned, laying back and placing her face in her hands. Ugh. And speaking of, I think I'm at my limit. Can you help me down? Deku reached towards her, then paused and sat back down in his cross-legged posture, shaking his head. Uraraka, this is supposed to be quirk training, right? Well, quirks are like muscles, and you have to use them to train them. But you don't get stronger by just doing what you can. You get stronger by pushing yourself to and past your limits and letting your body heal. If I throw up and fall to my death, I'm haunting you, she swore, sitting back up and bouncing just a bit as the centrifugal force of the planet pushed on her weightless body. Just look on the bright side. Since your whole body's 0G, the blood doesn't rush to your head, so you don't get head and stomach aches even faster, he prompted, smiling brightly. You're too happy for someone who's fallen from the ceiling 3 times today. I'll make you a deal, he deflected, rubbing his bruised shoulder absent-mindedly. If you can win this game, I'll clean everything up myself instead of together. You're going down, Ochako vowed, pushing her queen to take his rook in revenge. Deku smirked and pushed his pawn forward again. She wondered why he was so insistent on having it march to its death against her remaining knight. Deciding it was a distraction, she moved up her queen to just shy of the king. Check 3, the reckoning. Pulling his king sideways, Deku's eyes twinkled evilly. Ochako didn't like it when he smiled with dark intent. It ruined his cinnamon roll factor, which was something she wouldn't stand for. Deciding to risk her move, she pulled her rook up to try and wall off the king's range. He grinned and pushed his pawn forward again. She placed down 2 lanes of death, giving his king no choice but to retreat. He pushed towards her rook as he evaded, his confidence never wavering. She glanced back at the rook, seeing if it could switch to the other side, and decided to risk it. They danced around for a bit, including a clever switch where he got to the other side of her blockade by using a pawn as a shield, his actual destination as opposed to her rook. For a moment afterwards, she thought she had him, but heard him laugh. She looked over to see him push his pawn into the end, picking it up and replacing it with a queen. Shido, she grumbled. What? Nothing, just lamenting my crushed hopes and dreams. Ochako tried to keep up, but with his king still hiding, and a spare queen to help him chop up her remaining pieces, it was all a staying action. In the end, she knocked over her own king when he quietly reminded her, checkmate. Good game. Deck, she broke off, turning away and tilting her head up to release a stream of sparkly unhappiness from her mouth and down to the floor. That's the sign we're done. Deku unclipped the weights he'd strapped to his body, most of them dangling by ropes he'd found somewhere, letting them fall back down to the easily replaced concrete. Stepping over to her, he held her shoulders, and when she nodded, shifted around to rub her back a little. It was nice, having a friend who cared so much. Right, let's get you down, he conceded, quickly boxing their game and handing it to her. Taking the chess set, Ochako let Deku pick her up and curled towards him subconsciously, not remembering the last time she'd felt this much like garbage. He gave her a little squeeze of reassurance, before flipping them and descending slowly to land a few feet away from the vomit. Okay, you're good, he verified, glancing around for a moment to make sure no one was around. Touching the pads of her fingers together, Ochako felt like a heavy burden was just removed from her entire body. Our release, she whispered. Every weight she'd been able to float suddenly detached from the ceiling where they'd become stuck, smashing the ground in various spots. She groaned as she saw how much they had to clean. Don't worry, Deku soothed. You can take a rest while I get a mop and bucket, drink some water, and maybe do some stretches. You'll feel better. He offered her a water bottle, and Ochako gave him a thankful smile before laying down and pretending she'd died. Deku chuckled at her antics, before heading off to the janitorial closet. I wonder why I'm so bad at chess, Uraraka mused, sweeping at the concrete powder around one of the impact points. It's because you're too focused on one piece, Izuku guessed, stacking the last of the weights where they belonged and turning back to her. You were so busy trying to get my king that you didn't see where any of the other pieces were, or how I might want to use them. You have to guess at a lot of possible moves and figure out what your opponent's thinking. Kind of like you and Kat-chan, she surmised, tapping her chin thoughtfully. Well, yeah, I guess kind of, but I've been friends with him for a long time, so I don't know if I really can call it prediction at this point, he amended. That too, but you have the same problem I do, don't you? She clarified. Izuku blinked, trying to figure out what she meant by that. He didn't throw up, he just fell. Unless she meant in chess, but he was always overthinking things when it came to pretty much everything, didn't he? I mean, whenever we train and you two are against each other or able to compare scores, you guys look like fated rivals or something. Uraraka continued, fingering the broom and shuffling her feet a little in her adorably embarrassed posture. Or maybe I'm projecting, I dunno. Glancing down at the floor, Izuku didn't see his surroundings as his mind rewound to the last few times he'd been in such situations. That was right, he had been competing with Kaken. And in more ways than just the other students. Even in just the first battle training, he'd intentionally sent Uraraka off to deal with Ido alone, despite her not being suited to one-on-one combat in enclosed spaces. Also, he could duel his bully and prove himself capable. But he hadn't been doing it for himself, or All Might, or anyone else who really mattered. He'd been doing it for Kaken, who now hated him more than ever. Deku. Izuku shook himself, returning to the present and realizing Uraraka was shouting at him from the floor. Glancing down, he realized that while he'd been pondering and probably muttering something vaguely related, he'd inadvertently activated his 0% float and begun to drift like something Uraraka had touched. Comically, he'd also stayed in a perfectly straight posture, as if standing, despite being at a 30-degree angle from normal. Sorry, I, was overthinking things, he apologized, easing himself down. You do that a lot, she teased, breathing a sigh of relief. So, we done for the day? Actually, there was one thing I wanted to do before we ended, Izuku mumbled, itching at the back of his head. Was he really considering doing this with a girl? With his best friend Uraraka? Granted, it would be better than with Kaken, and probably Ida too, but maybe Kaminari or Sato might make better partners for his first time. I wondered if we could. Maybe, if you want to. Spar a little, he whispered, a bit lamely. Spar, Uraraka clarified, tilting her head cutely. Sure, but I don't really know how we'd do that. I'm not really up for hitting the floor right now. Well, I was thinking we could go out to the grass and try it there, he clarified, and it wouldn't be anything intense. Just takedown training. So, like tackles. Well, I'd take the role of a villain, and you'd trap me or defeat me somehow. Then we'd switch. Oh, Uraraka beamed, and since we're pretty much burned out for our quirks, it'll be harder. Izuku nodded, and she gave him the thumbs up. All right, he cheered, nodding for the open doors. Wanna race? You'd win, you cheater, she laughed, finishing her sweeping job and going to put the broom away. Not all of us can have it both ways. Her comment confused Izuku, and as she walked back from the closed janitor's closet, she realized he didn't know what she meant. Uraraka smiled and poked his chest. Deku, your face looks like a teddy bear, but you're also pretty fit. It's really jarring when your shirt is destroyed or missing. Oh, I'm sorry. Don't be. It's kinda cute, she laughed, jogging towards the shaded grass area a bit outside of the quirk training gym. Picking up his pace to keep up with her, Izuku felt his face shift to a bright red. Why was it so hard to deal with girls? Especially Uraraka. The other girls he knew were getting easier to talk to, especially after working with them in class and seeing them as heroes first. But Uraraka never ceased to fluster him. Swallowing, Izuku tried to get his focus back. Coming to a stop on the grass, Uraraka bounced a little and brought her hands up in a mock fighting stance. All right, villain, she proclaimed, trying to imitate Ida's intense posture from the indoors battle. I will stop your machinations here. Prepare yourself for my signature combat moves, the beautiful tea-child, Ochako style. Grinning and getting into character himself, Izuku scrunched his face up into his best all might, but with a more maniacal grin. Fear greatly, citizen. Your hope has departed, for I have appeared, he proclaimed, holding out his arms in the most pompous stance he could manage. For a moment, they both stood utterly still. Then the scene broke, with Uraraka literally spitting her laugh across the grass while Deku shook with restrained laughter. You can't just play anti-all might. That's no fair, she managed, pointing at him and her face. How do you even do that? You cast like impossible shadows. This is coming from Ms. Beautiful Tea-Child. You tell a villain that much, and they're gonna track you down outside of work hours. What if they catch you napping? He teased back, holding his diaphragm a little, or even worse, cooking. How would cooking be worse than sleeping? Uraraka asked, easing up a little. Izuku held up his finger authoritatively, his expression intense. Household fires from stoves, ovens, and other cooking devices left unattended are a serious hazard. Be sure to turn them off before doing anything else, even fighting villains. No dish is worth your home. Uraraka held his gaze for a solid 2 seconds, before breaking back into uncontrolled laughter and rolling on the ground. Why, you can't quote the 13 holiday special at this time of year, she gasped, wiping at a few tears. I'm never gonna be able to unhear you saying that now, you know that. Then you admit defeat, foolish hero, he asked, politely. Never. Managing to get back to her feet, Uraraka got back into her battle stance and charged him. Ochako style, she called, leaping at him. Izuku was surprised, and only managed to get his arms up by the time she'd run right into him. Her arms wrapped around his midsection, her head buried in his stomach. She didn't move. Uraraka, he asked, turning red. She twisted around to look up at him, smirking. Ochako style, secret technique, hug of destruction. Izuku had to admit, she'd won. No villain would expect a hug, and with her floating quirk, even if they retaliated, they'd just propel themselves into the air faster. He also had to admit, it was ultra effective on him. Chapter 7, Sports Festival Arc PT. 1. The Sports Festival begins. Summary. Exactly what it says on the tin. Notes. Chapter text. Ochako laughed, glad Sue was able to add some levity to the tension before the festival began. She was about to try and respond with her own joke when the room suddenly felt much more tense. Turning to glance over at the problem students, she stiffened a little. Todoroki was glowering at her Deku, speaking for the first time she could recall. I will beat you. Normally, Ochako would leave the boys be, let them fight it out however they felt like, but she'd spent the last week or so building up Deku's confidence and bonding with her flying bestie. She held up a finger to Tsu, silently asking for a second while she took some action. Getting a nod, she turned and marched over to the half and half recommendation student. She positioned herself beside Deku, coming up beside him and nudging his arm with her shoulder. Ochako wasn't going to step in if she didn't have to, but she also needed to make sure he stood up for himself. Todoroki took notice of her positioning and grimaced even more. From what I've seen, your quirk might just be an illusion, using hers to pretend you're top tier, he said, his voice monotone. I'll expose your little sham if it's true. Deku clenched his fist, clearly thinking about something. When he looked up, his eyes were full of an intensity she felt rather proud of. I don't know why you felt the need to challenge me like this, he said, his expression grim, but everyone, even students from the other courses, were all aiming for the top. You're right, I'm behind everyone with my quirk. And you're right, objectively, that I'm behind you. Most of us are. Deku grinned, glancing at Ochako for a moment. Not like he was seeking approval, but as if to indicate she was part of his next words. But we're not gonna roll over for you. I'm not going to fall behind. And if you're so certain my quirk is why I'm here, then I guess I have to show you otherwise. Ochako wondered what Deku meant by that, but like most of the other people in the room, she was kind of swept up in his fervor. As Todoroki brushed past her, she reached over and took Deku's hand, careful to keep her pinky free. That was pretty cool, but what do you mean by that? She asked quietly. He shot her a smile which seemed more nervous than she'd expect from the bold boy who'd just challenged the icy powerhouse of the class. If I have to, I'll win this tournament without my quirk, he managed, swallowing. Hey, that was my plan when I went into the entrance exam anyway. Ochako blinked at him. Maybe she'd overdone the confidence. That or she'd forgotten to account for his annoyingly strong sense of honor. Deku, I don't want to say that's a terrible idea, but I have no other words, she prodded, watching him with worry. Yeah, but I can't help but feel like Todoroki. Like he's someone who needs saving, he whispered, looking after him as the two-haired student left. The one who made it back to the stadium first is none other than Izukumidoriya, came present Mike's scream. And Ochako felt her chest bubble with giddiness. She couldn't believe it. He'd made it all the way through without using his float once, tossing Todoroki and Kat-chan aside with apparent ease. Now it was time for her to catch up too. Taking a page out of Deku's book, Ochako leapt towards one of the mounds with a grenade near the end of the course. Touching her hands together, she scrunched her knees below her into a shield. She only just brushed the sensor, her momentum carrying her down for a bit before planetary spin picked her up. It was enough though. The blast hurt her knees and probably burned her leggings, but it was worth it to see 5 other students fall behind her as she soared after the leaders. She crashed into the ground, hard, but managed to keep herself moving a few more seconds. Sliding through the gate, she let herself fall to the ground. She inhaled deeply, grinning at the sky. A shadow fell over her face, and Ochako glanced over at whoever was casting it. Her grin became even brighter as she saw the concerned, emerald eyes of her bestie. She managed to get her hand up and give him the thumbs up. A smile touched his lips too, and he nodded in approval. By the time the final contestant arrived, she had her breath back and managed to get up into the group clustered towards Midnight's podium. She settled close to Deku, ready to show him and everyone else she could keep up. She'd promised herself she'd become famous and help ease her parents' burdens, and now was the time to do so. Now on to the second event, Midnight declared proudly, snapping her whip a little and grinning down at the students. I, of course, already know what it is, of course. Are you dying in suspense? Our next event is... She gestured to the giant screen behind her, grinning maniacally at the words, cavalry battle. This, as if Deku's victory had infected the rest of the students. A number of muttered conversations popped up, the various groups discussing the possibilities and tactics. Midnight didn't seem very happy about being ignored. I'm about to explain it, so just shut up already, she shouted, snapping her whip a few times. The voices died out, and Midnight seemed to compose herself. Anyway, yes, your individual point values start at 5, at the bottom. So the student who took 42nd place is worth 5 points, 41st is worth 10. Get it? But Midnight's smile shifted to her patented rated R grin as she aimed her whip at Deku. Our first place participant is worth 10 million points. The entire stadium suddenly felt much colder. It felt like everyone was staring at Deku now, their eyes hungry and menacing. She didn't like it. Glancing at him herself, Ochako felt her face soften and hoped he would see her expression. He needed to know he wasn't alone. That he wasn't going to be taken out by something as silly as this. This survival game is a chance for a comeback. It's anyone's game. Midnight finished dramatically, before setting into clarifying the rules. Ochako saw Deku start to mutter to himself almost instantly, clearly going about his plans on who to pick and what to do. She wanted to go over and join up with him, but worried she wasn't right for his plan. Her fears were, of course, waylaid when everyone else on the field started drifting away from him. Everyone not in class had no idea what he was about. His bet to go quirkless for Todoroki still in place when he'd won the prior challenge. Everyone who did know he could fly were put off by his point count. Hey Deku, We should team whoa. As he turned to her, his eyes were out putting a bit of salt water, and by a bit she meant enough that she was currently holding up her hands in a defensive stance. Are you sure? He finally managed. Everyone's probably coming after me, and you could get hurt. She smirked and gave him a soft slug on the shoulder. Nah, we'll just fly away. Plus, it's better to lose while helping a friend than win against them. Something seemed to be hurting Deku, because his face scrunched up into a rather unappealing grimace. Gah, what's wrong? You just got all ugly. She complained. Sorry, you're just so Uraraka I can't bear to look at you, Uraraka, he muttered, which she decided to take as a compliment. Actually, I was hoping to team up with you. The problem is, we'd need 1 or 2 other people to make it work, and I don't think. Team up with me, Mr. First Place, came a voice from behind Deku. For a moment, Ochako worried he'd activated his quirk on accident, but then realized he just jumped out of fear. Sorry, you were just way too close, he managed, clutching at his chest. I need some kind of radar for people coming close to me. Who are you? I'm Hatsume, from the support course. I don't know you, but I could be useful to someone in your position. Huh, you're not really one to mince words, are ya? Ochako muttered, surprised at how forward and upbeat the woman was about literally using Deku for advertising purposes. Her surprise quickly turned to annoyance as Hatsume started to take Deku's attention away and to her gadgets. It was kind of bothersome, though she couldn't say why. Luckily, when he caught sight of one particular unit, his eyes went unfocused and he grinned. You're on, he promised, giving her a thumbs up. Uraraka, can you and Hatsume get geared up while I'm gone? You'll both need hover boots and whatever capture or subdual items you'll be comfortable with. Right, Ochako promised, giving him the thumbs up. I won't let you down. Where are you going? To get the missing member of our team, he said, grinning back. He marched away, heading for the bird-headed Takoyami, speaking with him for a moment before getting a nod of agreement and going to register their team. Takoyami turned away and bowed to the 2 girls. I look forward to working with you, he said simply, accepting the jetpack. A bird-like phantom floated free from his body, giving them what was probably a grin, alongside a massive thumbs up. Ochako didn't know why, but it seemed very comfortable to be around right then, almost friendly. All right, wake up, Eraserhead. Present Mike called. They've had time to form teams and strategize, and all 12 teams are lined up and ready to move. Interesting, came the tired mumble. Izuku prepared to mute them out of his mind, his hands back in Uraraka's and his shoulders gripped by his allies. It was time to move. They all knew the plan, and it was time they employed it. Let's get a battle cry. Here comes the starting signal. Blood begets blood in the UA. Grand match, Mike screamed to the crowd. Uraraka, right. Hatsume, oh boy. Takoyami, ready. Izuku gritted his teeth. Let's win this, he screamed. Midnight's whip cracked, and a buzzer sounded the clock had begun. Without wasting any time, 2 teams rushed them, calling their challenges. Right off the bat, just like you said, 10 million. Hatsume grinned. Such is the fate of those who are pursued. Takoyami agreed, prepared to enact Phase 1. They attempted to run away, but found the ground beneath them was becoming suddenly. Clear, skip to Phase 2, Izuku shouted, earning a nod from the rider. The 2 girls braced against the boys, and with a click, the jetpack fired and they started rising slowly. Deku kicked in his float at his 3% limit, forcing it up to 4% in an effort to keep pace with the jet. The ground snapped, and they launched into the sky. A good deal of the competition seemed to be trying to figure out where they'd come down, only to blink as they slowed to a halt in the middle of the arena, still in the air. Izuku felt a swell of pride in Uraraka. She'd managed to float herself and Hatsume without too much difficulty, and was holding off her motion sickness quite well. The only weight which remained was Takoyami, who was counterbalancing the spin of the earth as they held position. Some attacks were flung their way, but most fell short. Those that did manage to become a threat were quickly batted aside by Dark Shadow. Whoa, and with a gravity-defying leap, Team Takoyami has taken to the skies. High flyers indeed. Mike's voice echoed over the cheers. You're getting pretty full of yourself, huh, you bastard. Izuku turned to see Kaken racing up at them, blasting himself through the sky like some kind of deformed rocket. However, as he swung for his favored right hook, an ethereal arm batted him aside, knocking him back down towards his horse. Immediately turning, Izuku pointed at Team Todoroki. He'll land before coming back, prepare to dodge, he called, using his meager skill at float to guide them back towards the edge of the arena. He knew from watching that Todoroki's ice was more than strong enough to reach them up there, and now that Kaken had opened the field to aerial attacks, he'd be running up to get them. But there were a few things Izuku knew would let them still win. 1. Todoroki needed their headband, and wouldn't risk covering it. 2. Todoroki had to worry about disabling his own team if he went all out. 3. As Todoroki was a rider and not a horse, he would be limited to his arm, not his feet. Izuku's predictions were right on the money. A moment after the other teams started going after one another instead of him, barring a few holdouts, Todoroki leapt from his formation and summoned an Arctic pillar to launch himself at Takoyami. It was just as futile as Kaken's attack, leaving him falling to earth and having to be saved by his team. The rage in the Son of Endeavor's eyes was enough that Izuku knew they'd pushed him far enough. He glanced over at Kaken, grinning as he saw the spiked blonde revving up his arms after taking out someone from Class 1B. If they both attacked now, it would just work. Phase 3. Deku shouted, letting go of Uraraka and Hatsume's hands. Takoyami clambered around to sit on his shoulders, now supported solely by Float and the emergency jetpack. The girls disengaged, falling with controlled air from their boots. Izuku didn't focus on them. They knew their missions, and he trusted them. For a moment, things seemed almost peaceful, simply holding position in the sky. Dark Shadow seemed to shiver, but not with cold, and Izuku heard Takoyami whisper something to himself. So this is where we were meant to be. What's this? It seems Team Takoyami has another trick up their sleeve. They've broken apart, leaving themselves with greater maneuverability, but less defense. All warfare is deception. Now the enemy believes they know our plan. We shall subvert their power, Takoyami intoned, clenching a fist. Izuku couldn't agree more. As the two heavy hitters of the class raced towards them again, Deku pulled out the capture net item Hatsume had given him. He would shoot Todoroki, and when Kaken got decked by Dark Shadow again, they'd move. But as the two got closer, Deku felt an odd sensation in his gut. It was almost like disappointment. Heroes save the people first, defeat the villains second. Internally, Izuku cursed himself. He realized the saying wasn't just correct, but in that moment, it was also the right course of action. Todoroki wasn't using his fire, which meant the net or Dark Shadow could take him down easily. But Kaken was using explosives, as per usual, which emitted light. While being fought by the superior firepower of Takoyami's quirk would have shown Kaken that Izuku still respected him as an opponent, and the net would humiliate him. Izuku realized that he couldn't keep playing rival to someone so determined not to give him the same respect. I'm sorry, Kaken, he thought to himself, priming the net launcher. Takoyami, when I say now, punch right, then swing Dark Shadow's body left. He called back. They waited a few more heartbeats, then Izuku deactivated Float. They began to fall, and he screamed up at his new friend, now. Dark Shadow swung for all she was worth, and Izuku fired straight up. Todoroki was impacted in the gut, using his ice to freeze the arm which got him, but now floating free with a winded expression. Dark Shadow swung left, and her arm cracked against Kaken's explosions, shattering and blinding him for a moment. The two collided in midair, followed by the net. The two struggled against it and one another, and as they growled and pushed and punched, Dark Shadow pulled away all of their headbands. She seemed to grin at him as she placed them in Takoyami's hand, who reversed them and fastened them around his neck. Even in the blazing sun, our dark might cannot be pierced, he growled, grinning like a madman. Izuku gave him and Dark Shadow the thumbs up, glancing down to see Hatsume and Uraraka soaring back up to them a bit clumsily. I say we go to phase 4, he checked. Let them know our power. Taking that as a yes, Izuku lowered them to reattach to their companions, who revealed what they'd been up to. Holy, when in the world did Present Mike started? Hatsume, Izuku asked, adjusting the headset she'd given him earlier and grinning as the boards updated below. Ready. And in a shocking turn of events, it seems Team Takoyami's been busy at work while everyone else has been playing keep away. Good lord, Eraserhead, I know you said this isn't you, but... Tapping the mic button, Deku heard the audio cut out and shift over to him. On the scoreboard, their points jumped to 10,004,295, while everyone else's hit 0. The crowd gasped in surprise and amazement, but quickly quieted themselves as a new voice came over the speakers, Izuku's voice. You're holding back, he shouted, silencing everyone, including the other students. They all looked up at him and his team, and he grinned as the cameras too focused up at their team. Every team lost their points to us because you're all holding back. I know for a fact, some of you are only half trying. Others are hoping to skate by on the bare minimum until everyone else is tired so they can get the easy win. Well, guess what? Heroes don't get to half-ass the job. That means one thing. He nodded, and Hatsume tied in all 4 of their voices for the final announcement. We won't accept anything but your best. You want to pass, you go plus ultra and get your points back. They returned the sound back to Present Mike, and each pulled out their weapons of choice. Stun launchers, net cannons, Dark Shadow, or simply their hands. Izuku felt an odd swelling of pride, but not how he expected. Instead of self-assurance, it felt like it was directed at him from somewhere inside himself. It was quickly drowned out by pride for the students who were finding ways to get up to them, not taking his challenge lying down, which then changed to fear. It looks like Team Takoyami has just gone all in on this gambit. They've called out everyone here, and everyone's calling. Is it a bluff, or do they have the cards? The sides all exchanged fire, with a flung minded trying to tag them with one of his balls, but missing out of sheer fear as he arced up and over them, Tsu's throw a little off. Yaoyorozu had opened up with cannon fire, which was not pleasant. But somehow, between the various dodges and unrelenting counterattacks, they were holding ground, keeping their headbands out of the other's hands. Once, a girl with vines for hair got tantalizingly close, but as she reached for a neckband instead of the head, Takoyami's beat moved down and she withdrew out of fear, missing her shot. But as they fought on, it began to feel oddly easier. Izuku looked around and realized he'd guided them under the shade of the glacier Todoroki had made to try and reach them. He grinned, ready to add a new aspect to their plan. Todoroki, I thought you said you'd beat me. The half-and-half student seemed to combust with rage, and for a single instant, Deku thought he saw flames licking his arm. But then it was gone, and he merely shot another glacier at them, which was exactly what Izuku wanted. They swung around, allowing it to crash into the other, making two walls of ice and increasing both their defense and shadows. The attacks were more focused on the front now, but Dark Shadow was starting to counterattack, warding most of the others off. Todoroki's team came racing around the side, and he launched another glacier at them in blind anger. Izuku realized he might have just killed his team, seeing the ice race at him. Todoroki might just freeze them all and then have someone tunnel down to pull the headbands off. He couldn't think of how to stop the sheer firepower of the ice. Do your best, Izuku. It felt like a pair of hands took his arm in them, guiding him knuckle on towards the ice. The power of one for all raced up his body, but without float. He wound his arm back, feeling the energy adjust without his intent, moving to hover around 30%. He didn't question it, and simply punched. It felt like every muscle in his arm had been shredded, bruised, and worked for weeks without reprieve. It might have tensed up and curled into a ball, but it didn't seem to even be able to do that much. The rewards were worth it though. A rocket of air smashed into the ice, not enough to shatter it all, but enough to deflect it around them, sealing their formation in a cave of ice. Izuku didn't wait for the teachers to react, and knew he wouldn't get the chance again. He punched with his left arm, equaling out the pain and finishing his arms entirely, blowing a small hole into the most shallow area for others to attempt to get in. Dark Shadow began to roar, growing in size and menace. But oddly, Deku didn't feel threatened by it. It felt like an angry mother, which he realized fit. Takoyami's ghostly companion felt very much like a she, though it wasn't obvious until the moment they'd begun to fly, and Takoyami's wonder had pierced his barriers for that single moment. Time's up, echoed through to them, and Izuku's heart fell. He'd meant to draw out their power and determination, not strand everyone outside of the tournament. He realized he had to fix it now. Hatsum, the comms. On it. He clicked on again, but it wasn't his own voice which echoed through to them. Am I a dog? Am I a cat? A bear? A mouse? A mole? Or something else? Who knows? It doesn't matter. Starting now, we've moved into the emergency contingency overtime. The 4 members of Team Takoyami have secured their spots in the next round, but no one else has. If I've counted right, as I always do, they have 12 headbands in there with them. The new rule is, each headband is worth 1 slot in the next round. Your teams stay, so if you all want to move on, you better grab one for everyone. If you want to keep it all to yourself, then you'd best prove you're the one who should keep the glory. Disassemble your horses, and get ready for this test of courage. Deciding to play into Principal Nezu's game, Izuku, Uraraka, and Hatsum screamed in terror, while Dark Shadow roared playfully. What did that nerd think he was doing? How dare he cheat and grab the spotlight like that? This was his moment, and he wasn't going to let a useless Deku like him steal it from him. Move it, you extras, he screamed, leaping down and sprinting for the entrance. He was met by a black fist the size of a truck, launching him back across the ground and into Kirishima's arms as he skidded past the other teams. Okay, so that strategy was out. The one with the engine started doing his run thing, and shouted something that sounded kind of cool, if really lamely spoken. Recipro something. It seemed to pay off too, as in a moment he simply vanished from where he'd been standing, evidently inside. For I know the Lord giveth no commandments unto the children of men, save he shall prepare a way for them that they may accomplish the thing which he commandeth them. Katsuki glanced over at the plant-haired chick, who was evidently psyching herself up as she walked calmly towards the dark opening. He was about to laugh as she ate dirt, but blinked in surprise as she suddenly dropped into a combat crouch and rushed the entrance, her vines snapping in and then ripping her after them with amazing speed. He glanced around to see others heading for it, though a few abstained. A few, like the Monoma punk, waved it off, gravitating towards teams who'd sent in a few runners, as if he was going to just steal theirs after they got it back. A snap of Midnight's whip drew both of their attention. Just so you all know, once you come out of that ice cave, that headband belongs to your team. If you try to steal one, your whole team's disqualified, she hissed. I don't like lazy students, almost as much as I don't like selfish and lazy lovers. From the looks of it, only Todoroki and Bakugo from Class 1 have yet to at least attempt going in. Not only that, but even Shinso from General Studies has teamed up with his former horseman Ajiro to try and breach the dark maw before them. Present Mike yelled distractingly. Of course, came Eraserhead's grouchy voice. Technically, I can't expel any of them while they're in the festival. But my class knows two things better than any other first years do right now. Not to hesitate. And that if they don't even try after a spectacular failure like what got them into this situation in the first place, they shouldn't come to class tomorrow. That was enough. Katsuki wasn't going to just sit there and take this. SHY hair. Let's go, he roared, grabbing the boy's shoulder and holding him out in front. Bringing his arms back, Katsuki started blasting them forward with full force, aiming for a side of ice they were going to ram through like a jet missile. Kirishima grinned and locked his arms over his face, and they smashed into the dark. What happened next he didn't know. There were sounds and impacts, and people were moving, but he couldn't see. He considered making a few lights with his hands, but knew he'd become a target instantly if he did. After about 2 minutes of being batted around inside, he decided he'd had enough. Y'all better duck, you damn extras. Raising his hands to the sky and straining them for everything they were or ever would be worth, Katsuki fired his quirk. The resulting explosion knocked him on his backside, slamming and pressing him into the ground as the ice blew apart, revealing the sky again. He could hear bodies flying everywhere, and didn't think he could even stand, let alone find a headband. He managed to raise an arm, trying vainly to block out the sun. Something fluttered into his palm, and he grasped it tightly. And in an explosive finish, it seems all the headbands are now distributed. Mike screamed with the crowd's support. It seems Midoriya finally drew out the plus ultra in these kids. Katsuki managed to shuffle into a sitting position, blinking around at the remains of the cave. A few students were holding their prizes proudly, while others were toast. He didn't doubt that every single one of them had given their all. So, why had it taken so long for him to do the same? Glancing down at the bandana, he realized it was the 70, the lowest score available. He'd pushed himself to the edge, yes, but only at the last second, and only when he'd had nothing left to lose. But Deku could have just waited in the air. He could have flown higher and just remained on the defensive. He would have won anyways, but he chose to push himself. Oi, Bakugo, congrats, came a voice at his side. Katsuki turned, seeing Kirishima grinning at him, his own hands empty. Nice. You be sure to give Midoriya what for? Okay. He grinned. He's so freaking manly, dude. I can't wait to see you two duke it out. I'm gonna go congratulate him while you get registered. The red-headed idiot stood up and jogged over to where Katsuki realized Deku was sitting. His jaw dropped at the sight of the boy. His arms were red, like they were bleeding, but without any on his skin. He seemed dead on his feet, and Katsuki realized he wasn't actually standing, but behind held up by a nice structure. Todoroki had evidently found him at the end and tried to hold him down, right up until the blast. Speaking of half and half, the boy was standing beside Midoriya, holding his original headband in a flaming hand, looking at it as if unsure what he was seeing. He'd been holding back too. He saw how the bird thing shrunk in light, which meant the fire could have won the match way earlier. But he'd held back, been arrogant enough to assume he was just that much better than the rest, not unlike Katsuki himself. Bakugo, I take it you'll be moving on to the tournament? A teacher asked, coming over with a clipboard. Glancing up at Cementos, Katsuki was about to enter, but sighed. Send Kirishima on. I'm tapping out here, he managed. You tell him I did though, and I'll blow your rectangle face off. Noted. Chapter 8, Sports Festival Arc PT. 2. Nana Shimura. Summary. As we make our way into the sports festival proper, Izuku has an unexpected visitor. Notes. Chapter text. All four of them placed their knuckles together, leaving a small square of empty space in the middle as they said farewell. See you in the finals, they chanted, before pulling back. Izuku was positively giddy. He hadn't believed he would win not only one round, but two. As he turned to wait for the tournament brackets, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Takoyami still standing there, looking a bit contemplative. What is it, Takoyami? The bird-headed student sighed, before looking up at him and smiling. Thank you for freeing us, he muttered, as if not wanting to be overheard, for showing us the skies for what they can be. Izuku positively beamed at his new friend. I'm glad I could help you two out. Oh, by the way, is Dark Shadow? It seems like it's fairly sentient. Takoyami nodded, releasing his spiritual companion to come out and offer its hand. She is, Takoyami confirmed. In fact, I don't think she's ever been so vibrant before today. Because today I got to taste the sky and have a nest to protect for the first time, she said, offering up her own hand. Thanks, Midoriya. Extending his hand, Izuku grasped the Inkai black limb and gave it a small bob of confirmation. That seemed to satisfy the creature, and it quickly retreated from the light of day. Oddly, Izuku felt his hand tug with it for a moment, followed by a gasp from Takoyami. You two are afflicted by darkness. Izuku glanced down at his hand, to see an odd array of black and bluish tendrils warping along his palm. He shivered and clenched his fist. willing them to go back. The fear of them seemed oddly tinted by gloating. Where the heck was that emotion coming from? Can I trust you with a secret? He mumbled, glancing around. Uraraka was still nearby, but Hatsum had wandered off for maintenance. He could share it with them, he supposed. Takoyami nodded. The curse of trust and private information are powers no warrior would be rid of. As the three gravitated together again, Izuku opened his hand and let the black tentacles emerge from his skin just slightly. My quirk. I don't know how it all works, he explained, using the cover he and All Might had come up with. What we do know is that it didn't manifest until the day of the entrance exam. I think this is why. Affliction by darkness. Winning, Izuku chuckled. No, well, kinda in your case, Takoyami. Actually, you're both half right. You see, I think my power is like a copy quirk, but more specific. The first time I ever used my quirk, it was when I suddenly inverted my body's gravity against the zero-pointer, which happened right after I'd been affected by a zero-gravity quirk from the first real friend I ever made, and right before I went to save said friend. Uraraka gasped in surprise and wonder. And just now, I touched Dark Shadow directly. Right after we became friends, Takoyami, he continued, we are friends, right? Our dark brotherhood was forged in battle, right? But anyways, now I've started to manifest this sort of shadow rope energy. I don't know what it does, and I think I'm gonna have to keep it out of the fight for now, just in case it could hurt someone, Izuku decided. But what about that air thing you did? Uraraka asked, mimicking his punches. Those were so cool. I don't know, he admitted. It felt like my arms were being guided. Maybe I was localizing my float to just my arms or something, and moving them really fast. Regardless, I probably need to learn the true limits of my power, or else I'll end up like Todoroki, only using half my strength. Uraraka gave him a big thumbs up. Don't worry, Deku. You'll be the best before you know it. That's why your nickname's so fitting. So the title Deku means one who is the best, Takoyami clarified. No, Kaken named me Deku when we were kids, and said it meant useless. Mostly because my quirk didn't really activate back then, Deku whispered, embarrassed. But Uraraka, she said it sounded like Dekaru, you can do it. So I've kind of adopted the meaning of do your best. For Deku, to bend an affliction to a power is truly the height of dark power. Uraraka and Izuku glanced at one another, before smirking and starting to chuckle. Takoyami quickly joined in, the three of them laughing as they headed for Midnight's podium. I see the thieves are enjoying their spoils. The trio turned to see the blonde kid from Class 1B smirking at them, radiating an aura of disdain. I'd say that you'll be taken out in the first round, but I think those who made it in will tell you that, he continued, looking down on all of us, saying we weren't worthy of you in this tournament section. It sickens all of us, so don't be surprised if some of you don't have any friends in the hero course when you get back to class. With that, he walked off, leaving Deku feeling very small. Had it seemed that way? Had the others all thought them arrogant and rude? Don't listen to him, dude. That was so manly. You got us all off our butts and into the action. Two voices called in unison from behind him. Thank you for the opportunity, Midoriya. I wouldn't have made it to this round without you guys, Kiro. That bum's just sore he lost. We proved we're the ones willing to go the distance, and that means stuff to the big shots out there. For the power is in them, wherein they are against unto themselves. And inasmuch as men do good they shall in no eyes lose their reward. And you were all like you're not trying. And go plus ultra. And we were all like I'll show you plus ultra. And oh no the scary bird demon. And it was all like yes the scary bird demon. Midoriya, I apologize for holding back on you. I intended to join another team to prove I was a worthy rival to you, and that I respected your abilities. But I failed to live up to my ideals until the end. I will not fail you again. I was gonna tap out there for a bit, but then that last match gave me the drive to keep going, where I could really go all out. Please forgive me. I didn't respect your determination, nor expect it to grow this far, failing to remember the quirk test at the beginning of the year. I will not look down upon you again. Midoriya, that was a pretty metal move, sealing yourself in with a demon and daring us all to come in after you. I dig it, seeing almost everyone else in the tournament bracket praising him, thanking him even, for challenging them how he did. It was too much for Izuku. Uraraka saw the signs and paled. Everybody get down, she screamed, leaping at Sue and pushing them to the earth. Izuku turned his face skyward and cried tears of joy and relief, feeling the geyser of water push him down so hard it cracked the concrete they were standing on. The majority of the others around them either laughed or playfully screamed out in mock fear. Shizaki moved around to catch some of the water on her hair, evidently unbothered by using his weakness as an advantage for the next round. As he wiped his eyes, Izuku realized that two of the finalists weren't coming over to speak with him. One was Todoroki, obviously still annoyed at him, but the other was a purple-haired boy who Deku thought he'd seen as a rider on Ajiro's team. Shinso, wasn't it? They glared at him from opposite sides, though not as intensely as he'd expected. Izuku didn't have much time to dwell on it though. Alright, all you listeners, since that took a little longer than expected, we're gonna give you a quick taste of what's next before we hit lunch and recovery for our wonderful contestants. Like exclaimed, it's time for the event you've all been waiting for, the one-on-ones. So be sure to eat your food with gusto, because it might be your last. Midnight gestured to the massive screen once again, revealing the empty tournament brackets. Team Takoyami went up first, followed by the ones who'd grabbed headbands. A small shock ran through Deku as he saw Kaken's name wasn't present, but instead Kirishima's was. He whirled to find his old friend, only to see a vague outline of the boy appearing in the WhatIf viewing box. He smiled up at Kaken, wanting him to know he'd done the right thing. Distant explosions told him the gesture wasn't appreciated. Returning to the screen, Izuku looked over the matchups. Midoriya v Shinso, Todoroki v Ashido, Anjiro v Siro, Asui v Hatsune, Jiro v Yaoyorozu, Takoyami v Shizaki, Tetsu v Kirishima, Uraraka v Ida. So he'd be up against the general studies guy first. That was worrisome. He'd seen most of what the others could do, even if from afar, but his quirk and skills were still close to the chest. Hatsune had said she'd gone to grab his bandana, and that it had been the easiest. They were all, I dunno, kinda bored looking, she'd explained. Midoriya. Izuku turned, taking an involuntary step back as he found Todoroki right next to him. Let's talk. Hitoshi took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He wasn't liking his odds with this first matchup. The green-haired guy, Midoriya, he was pretty strong-willed, and clearly in this for the glory. That might make him easy to trick, but he might just toss Hitoshi right out of the ring with some kind of flying kick that would keep moving even if he was hypnotized. Ajiro hadn't been happy when he'd realized what Hitoshi'd done to him, but when he'd explained why, he'd promised not to tell anyone his secret so long as he got the first headband. Now that the two of them were in the tournament proper, he just had to hope he kept his word. Hopefully he'd be able to catch Midoriya off guard and show everyone that the glory hogs in the hero course were still only human. Luckily he was pretty well rested from that last bout. Otherwise he might not even be able to stand anymore. Luckily, the grape-haired pervert had been boasting loud enough for him to snag the headband before the anger management moron had tried to nuke them all. Stepping up to the ring, he prepared to give it his all once again. Making a weird face, despite his spectacular performances so far, it's Izuku Midoriya from the hero course versus the Invisible Man, who dove into the overtime test without fear but hasn't really done much otherwise. It's Hitoshi Shinso from General Studies. Hitoshi grinned at his opponent, who seemed rather queasy. Good, that meant he was off balance. The rules are simple. Win by knocking your opponent out of the ring, immobilizing them, or getting them to say I give up. Bring the pain. We've got our good old recovery girl on standby. And fight dirty if you must. Ethics have no meaning here. Of course, Cementos added, going for the kill is a no-go. I'd stop you, and you'd be disqualified immediately. I give up? Huh. Hitoshi smirked, trying to grab Midoriya's attention. You got that, Izuku Midoriya. This battle's a true test of will. Not that arrogant announcement and dirty eyes trick you pulled earlier. I suppose if you've got a dream though, you'll do anything to reach it, even cheat your way to the top? Huh. Start. After all, when you're born with the power to look down on everyone, hard work must not even be a factor, he finished, knowing he'd won. What did you say? Midoriya roared, starting to charge him. Hitoshi smirked as the other boy stopped dead, slowing and staring off into space. His eyes were the dull white gray of a hypnotized victim. I've won. Hey, what's up guys? The match only just started. Show some spirit. After a few moments of nothing happening, Hitoshi began to pace around, smiling at his prey. It would be good for everyone to see that even this high flyer wasn't invincible to his power. And just a few seconds into the match, Midoriya's frozen in place. Whoever this Shinso guy is, he just leapt from another player to someone to have a major eye on. Eraserhead began to say something, but Shinso wasn't worried about what they told the crowd. This was his match, and he was going to get some catharsis out on the boy prideful enough to claim he wasn't trying. It must be nice, sitting up there in your flying glass house. He spat, stepping closer and leveling a finger at the frozen hero student, able to avoid any problem by running and being praised for what genetics dealt you as if it was somehow earned. But today you learned the lesson those of us with quirks that aren't bred for public opinion learned on day one. Life's not fair. Now, he ordered, turn around and walk out of this ring. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Midoriya blinked. Izuku didn't know where he was. Everything was dark, and some kind of wind whipped around everything. All he could see was a concrete floor and a wall, where oddly smoky figures drifted around, their eyes and shapes giving off an odd familiarity. One looked somewhat like the skeletal form of All Might. He counted 7, but felt like he was missing one. He tried to call out to them, to figure out why he wasn't fighting Shinso, but couldn't speak. He had no mouth. He didn't have anything. He was just as smoky and wispy as the others, with only his eyes able to show he was even alive. Izuku. A sudden grip came at him from behind, wrapping him up in arms he couldn't recognize. He was turned around, and the hug became tighter. At first, he thought it was his mother, her hair and facial structure not too different from how Inko's used to be. Then he thought it might be a future version of Uraraka, her aura of love and pride so similar as she hugged him. But as he focused on her, things appeared different. If he really had to compare it to a sensation he knew, he'd have to go with being hugged by a very proud grandmother. I can't believe it. We didn't expect our quirks had come with. And when you became 9th, we worried you'd hurt yourself, but then I'm just so proud you got mine. She cheered, still not releasing him. A sensation of annoyance or perhaps gentle rebuke came from the other figures, but Nana scoffed at it like she could hear whichever one it was speaking. I have a grandson I can be proud of who's using my quirk. When he unlocks yours, you can be as calm as you want, she called back at them, before holding Izuku's smoke form at arm's length so they could see one another. I can see why Toshinori picked you, she nodded, and I completely agree. Might be a bit biased, but hey, sue me. Who? Where? What? Yeah, speaking's not really easy here the first few times, she apologized, but I get your drift. I suppose you can call me your quirk grandma. I was the 7th user of One for All, Nana Shimura. The shock must have been evident in his eyes or aura, because Shimura laughed a little. Just Nana's fine, Izuku. I've seen many of your rather prominent memories, and you're kind of stuck with us, so formalities aren't really important. Izuku managed a nod, and she smiled kindly. As for where and what, you can ask Toshinori when you get out. We don't have much time left. And I'm finishing up a little talk with Hito Shinso while you get your head back on. Hopefully we'll be able to speak again when you adjust more. Just remember, Izuku, we're all very proud of you, and the strongest heroes smile when things get tough, even after the toughest battle of their lives. Gritting himself, Izuku sent a wave of determination her way, his version of a promise to Nana that he would be worthy of her pride and trust. You already are. Tell Toshinori I'm proud of him, and he chose well. Now, get back out there, 9th. It wasn't the normal, sluggish blink of a natural body keeping itself functioning, but a determined and intense squishing of eyelids as if to clear one's thoughts. Then they opened again, and Hitoshi took an involuntary step back. His green eyes, once so vibrant with hope and joy, were gray. Not only were they the wrong color, but his entire aura shifted. Midoriya stood straighter, radiating confidence and experience. He looked down at his hands, giving them an experimental flex before looking up at the stands. He seemed to be looking for someone, and eventually settled on the exit behind him. Midoriya placed a finger at either corner of his mouth, before smiling brightly and tugging his cheeks just a bit. Then, he turned back to Hitoshi, and smiled more gently. Don't worry, I won't interfere in your match. I'm just here to say something. Something was wrong. Midoriya shouldn't be able to move with any intent while hypnotized, let alone speak. No one's ever had confidence in you, have they? Midoriya asked, his voice too somehow different, more elegant and experienced. However, there was one part that was still present, the one element of Midoriya that Shinso had been conflicted about fighting. The compassion and dedication of someone who wished to save others was still there. Hitoshi tried to muster the power to hypnotize Midoriya again. Of course not. But why would they when they have people like you to fawn over? Midoriya didn't even flinch as he replied. Evidently Hitoshi couldn't hypnotize people who were already hypnotized. No one ever fawned over Midoriya or his power. He said, evidently in third person, but it didn't feel as awkward as that should have been. They looked down on him just like you. He received red spider lilies on his desk, was bullied for being a nerd, and more than once contemplated ending this life and hoping for a better one in his reincarnation. The only difference between how he would be and how you are now is this. One man said the words he most needed to hear. The words I now say to you, Hitoshi Shinso. Midoriya stepped forward, holding his fist towards Hitoshi, not like a punch but like he wanted a knuckle bump. You too can be a hero. Hitoshi felt something give in his heart, and he choked out a laugh. Raising his own fist, he gently pressed it against the offered one. He felt the hypnosis snap inside Midoriya, and his eyes abruptly turned back to their usual emerald. The aura of strength vanished, leaving just the friendly boy he'd been about to humiliate. What's this? A sudden display of showmanship. What could these two be planning? All right, Midoriya, I don't know what just happened, or who hijacked my power over you, but I've got a proposition for you. No quirks, just you and me. We'll give the crowd a show, he offered, wondering if Midoriya would take the bait. You're on, he grinned, clenching his other fist in agreement. Hitoshi almost got him again for that, but decided instead to swing a punch into Midoriya's face. He deserved it for being so naive, even if he was justified. Midoriya stumbled back, before looking up at him and smiled back even wider than before. The two rushed one another, punching it out with no skill or powers, just straight up brawn against brawn. Each one of Midoriya's punches were fast and hard though, nearly winding him each time and pushing him a little further back. But he wasn't giving up. Hitoshi landed successful hits on weak spots and managed to slow his retreat up until the very edge. and now they're fighting on equal footing. Why aren't either of them using quirks? Who will last longest? What was up with that freaky smile towards the exit? Secret technique. Kangari smash. Midoriya roared, dodging Hitoshi's final straight and clotheslining him with his arm. Hitoshi was swung out of the ring, falling to the grass below with a soft impact that still jarred him. Shinso is out of the ring. Midnight shouted. Midoriya moves on to the second round. Well, it looks like we're starting off small today, but no less intense than any other round could be. Mike continued, much to the joy of the crowd. Let's give a hand for our barbaric boxers, short-lived but bright as the stars. Hey, good match. Hitoshi opened his eyes to see Midoriya standing over him, hand offered and a smile on his face. Sighing, he swung his arm up and took it, feeling himself pulled up in an instant. I suppose, he muttered, about to head off. He felt his hand catch in Midoriya's, and was about to ask what was up, when it was suddenly lifted in the air. He turned and realized why. The crowd cheered at the movement, and Midoriya was grinning at them and him in equal measure. They say that heroes who smile, even after the most intense battles, are the strongest, Midoriya said, nudging him. I think you're one of them. Swallowing, Hitoshi managed to get out a small beam to the people in the audience, earning a little surge of its own. Then he pulled away and let his more subtle grin take over. You can't choose the thing you admire, he said, heading for the exit. So, I'm glad you and I chose to pursue it anyways. You're gonna be a hero too, aren't you? Hitoshi nodded, still facing away. Then I promise you this, Shinso. He turned back, seeing Midoriya holding his hand out the same way he had before the hypnosis had broken. I won't hold back. I won't stop growing. When you make it to the hero course, I'll be there to challenge you every step of the way. Let's become heroes together. Hitoshi leveled his arm, giving him an air bump. See you there, Midoriya. Let's have a great match, Todoroki. Mina cheered, giving him a peace sign. He was always so dour and serious. Guy needed to lighten up a bit. Maybe if she got him a date. No, bad Mina. Now was not the time to indulge in shipping classmates. She could do that after by antagonizing Midoriya. And Uraraka. He's the best of the best, the strongest of the strong. Give it up for Shoto Todoroki. Versus the Pink Destroyer of Worlds, Ridley Scott's monster born again as a cutie of doom, Mina Ashido. You held back in the cavalry battle, Mina yelled, holding her arms to her sides and preparing an acid drip. Don't make the mistake twice or you'll regret it. Start. A wave of cold came her way, and Mina barely had time to leap up and away from it before she was sitting in midair with her back stuck in a glacier. She tried to get a look at it, but wasn't able to twist enough. Growling, she melted what she could and got free, slipping a little and sliding towards Todoroki. She recovered quickly, leaping back to her feet and jetting out acid to help her maintain speed over the rough ice. Nice shot, but I'm not just gonna sit here and take it, she roared, preparing to throw some acid at his clothes. Todoroki just glared at her, his expression so intense she almost tripped herself up. Readying a fist, she leapt off the ice and went for a solid hit to his solar plexus. Her hand got caught in something burningly cold, and before she could break out, the cold spread up her arm and over her whole body, leaving only her face exposed. Oh, Ashido. Midnight shivered. Can you move? I can't really see you from this angle. No, she chattered back. I'm out. Sorry. Todoroki sighed, placing a hand to the ice and starting to melt it. I overdid it a little. I was just annoyed. That's okay. Todoroki, Mina managed. Next time though, just ask me to help you find a date. Yeah, I'd rather not. Your name is Tashinori. Yes, didn't I tell you that? All Might checked, confused at why his pupil was being so frantic about his name. Sure, he'd always been a bit of a fanboy, but really this was too much. No, I had to hear it from Nana, Midoriya complained, folding his arms as if put out about it. And Nana, you mean Master Shimura? How do you know her? All Might asked, a little panicked. And how did you know her smile during your match? You mean, you never met a past user? Of course I did. So have you. I'm here, aren't I? No, I mean, when Shinso hypnotized me, I was in this windy place where all these smoke people were wandering around, and one even looked like you, but I couldn't move. I didn't really exist there, except for a shadow too, but I knew what my body was doing. But there was this one woman there. She called herself Nana Shimura, and she said she was talking to Shinso while I talked to her. Don't you know where or what that was? She said you would. All Might felt the energy slip out of him, wilting down to his skeletal form. He felt rather stunned. Had his pupil somehow contacted the vestiges of one for all within the quirk itself? He'd seen the afterimages of them periodically, usually in dreams, but never substantial enough to speak to or have them control his body. Oh, and before that, when I was in the cavalry battle, Midoriya continued, I didn't recognize it at the time, but I remember a voice talking to me really quietly, which I think was her, and she helped power my arms up for those strikes that shredded my muscles. Calm down, young Midoriya, Tashinori interrupted, giving his student a small bop on the head. Now try to calm down, and I'll tell you what I know. Midoriya nodded and took a seat across from him. having been patched up a bit by Recovery Girl and now waiting for the candy to kick in his system. Yes, I saw the spirits once, Toshinori admitted, when I was younger and had first received one for all. They're traces of the past users, including myself and my master, Nana Shimura. In my time they were little more than echoes, a few visual markers of the past. They never interacted with me or guided me so far as I can recall. Whatever happened out there must be special to you. Then, you don't know what this is? Midoriya asked, holding up his right hand. Toshinori shivered in awe and horror, already set off by the talking about ghosts and whatnot. Midoriya's hand was surrounded by thick, black and blue tendrils, not unlike the tentacles of a sea creature or squid ink. That's astounding. I imagined your body might try to tap into the quirks of past users, but not so quickly as this. He managed, gesturing for the boy to put it away. Did anyone else see it? Well, 2 people did, but I think I have a cover story for it and any other powers that might arise, Midoriya admitted, a bit sheepishly. A cover story for why you're developing multiple quirks at age 15. This I have to hear. Well, I unlocked float during the entrance exam, right? But I did it after I met Uraraka, and she helped me before the exam by tapping my shoulder and stopping me from falling. And I used it when trying to save her. And this power manifested right after I shook hands with Takoyami's quirk, Dark Shadow. I see. Then it was young Uraraka and young Takoyami who saw this. Yeah, I told them that my quirk didn't manifest until the day of the exam. But I added in a guess about why these quirks are awakening when they do, to help make it closer to the truth. I think I'm unlocking powers that are similar to quirks of people I've made a connection with. Toshinori mulled it over. It wasn't an impossible theory, he supposed. I noticed young Takoyami seemed oddly at ease when you flew together. I take it you two are friends then. In which case, your explanation has merit both in the cover and in truth. You're pretty sharp when it comes to quirks, aren't you? If you say so, All Might. So, what did Master Shimura say to you? I haven't talked to her in a while. Oh, she said she was my quirk grandmother, and that she was very proud of us. She apparently approves of me. All Might laughed, glad to hear his master was doing all right, if only in spirit form. Oh, she also told someone off who wasn't happy she was so excited. Do you know who any of the other users are? Midoriya inquired. I know of my master, and I asked her about how she received one for all once, so I know she got it from someone named N, but otherwise I don't have much. I've been putting out some feelers for information, but it's slow going. Oh, Midoriya sighed, frowning a little. Well, maybe I can ask some of them later. Later? What makes you think this wasn't a one-time event? Nana said she hoped we could talk again. She seemed pretty excited I was there. He's as plain as they come, but also the cream of the crop. Hand to Zero everybody. Versus the animal man himself, the king of the plain and simple, Mashirao Ajiro. Geez, you couldn't put a little more pizzazz into our intros, Zero muttered, earning a small grin from Mashirao. Well, it's not like he's wrong. Ready, start. Okay, I guess we're going now, Zero mumbled, turning around and opening up with his tape dispensers. Mashirao was faster, able to dodge out of the way in time with the range he had. The problem was, his speed wouldn't hold up as he got closer, and he couldn't win this far away. He had to think of something clever, something unpredictable, something, dare he say, unorthodox. Smashing his tail into the ground, he leapt up in the air over the next attack, wincing a little. It hurt, but he could stomach it. He did it again, feeling the concrete crack. On his third time, he felt the pieces give. Well, he's got so fired up, he's broken the very ground he's standing on. Leaning down, Mashiro hefted a plate from his work, then another. He found a pair which fit his needs, and nodded. Rushing his opponent, he held them up like shields, able to catch the tape on them and then discard it as he bounced closer. Praying he didn't look like Tigger, he caught and evaded a second attack, before rocketing into the air and descending on his opponent. He gave his tail a full body swing, catching Zero across the chest as he fell, and rocketing the other boy towards the wall. I can't lose like this. It's too normal, he roared, firing one last line of tape at Meshiro's body. They caught his arms, and Zero tried to swing back to him, only for his momentum to be cut as Meshiro's tail swung down and gave the tape slack. Zero's feet only had to brush the ground once for him to lose. Zero out. Midnight called. Ajiro advances. Unusual enough for ya. He checked, grinning. Zero groaned. Dude, even our catchphrases are plain. We gotta work on that in class or something. You're on, my guy. Chapter 9, Sports Festival Arc PT. 3. Tournament Arc. Summary. The world begins to shift beyond Class 1A's borders. Notes. Chapter text. After that, informative. Match. Present Mike yawned, having evidently fallen asleep as Hatsum used her various gadgets to evade and outwit Sue's attacks. Narrating them the entire hour, we move on to the long-awaited follow-up. It's the killer beauties of Class 1A. Steeling herself, Momo clenched her fists and prepared to fight against one of her first true friends. Gyro was so So cool. It wasn't fair she had to fight someone so impressive. Gyro was always laid back and spoke her mind so easily, and moved so decisively. She was psyching herself out over just the thought of the pre-match greeting. Would she be expected to insult or challenge her? Would it affect their friendship? Oh, there were too many things to consider. On one hand, the prodigal daughter come to jam out to the tunes of Victory, Kyoka Gyro. Versus, she's the 1% queen. She can be butcher, baker, or candlestick maker, Momo Yaoyorozu. Oh no, it was starting time. Gee, good luck, Gyro, she called, giving the thumbs up and bouncing on her feet a little. Gyro seemed to turn red, which worried Momo all the more. Was she angry at her? Why yeah, start. Deciding to play it safe, Momo produced a crude shield on her arm first, holding it up in defense as Gyro's jacks came whirling at her. She seemed to be only half looking at her, which meant the attacks were more tentative and not as accurate as they could be. Momo produced a simple bow staff, charging closer in an attempt to get Gyro to surrender without being hurt. As she neared, the jacks became more precise and much faster, and she was driven on the defense more and more. She realized her staff was no good, and slid it into the hand protected by a shield, preparing to make a full kite shield to simply push Gyro out with. Placing a hand on her chest, she prepared to summon it, when a small scream came from her opponent and one of the jacks jammed into her neck, vibrating with Gyro's erratic heartbeat. While normally the action would just stun and daze the recipient, like Minta and Kaminari experienced rather often, Gyro was evidently too panicked to control it, and after a few seconds of chills running up her spine, Momo fell over. As she lost consciousness, she registered a few things. One was that Gyro's heartbeat wasn't all that unpleasant to feel running through her, if a bit jarring and painful at the intensity her jacks produced. The second was someone shouting her name in apology. The last was a very soft pillow under her head. Poor Yaoyorozu Ibara sighed, watching Gyro rush by with her on a stretcher as they took her to rest in the first aid room. She wasn't particularly close with them, or anyone really, but she did have a certain respect for all participants in the tournament, and she supposed it wasn't all bad for the loser. Unlike the heiress, Ibara had some life experience to back up her intelligence, and knew what the looks the two cast at one another meant. It made her happy to see people find happiness together. Naturally, she couldn't just come out and say it. Oh no, no, no. For one thing, her religion was still with the stance that romance and marriage were inherently intertwined with celibacy, monogamy, and procreation. And while she happily congratulated and celebrated anyone who found any form of love in their rather chaotic world, she had to do so quietly and in a way that didn't result in a lot of misunderstandings and hurt feelings on both sides. For another, she wasn't some monster outing someone's crush without reason. If they kept dancing around one another for the next year, she might consider helping them along, but that was only a maybe. She shook herself, feeling a need to focus on the task at hand. This is the day which the Lord hath made, she whispered, using the quote from her scriptures to help calm her heart and focus her mind. Rejoice and be glad in it. She could worry about the future later. Now it was time to show the world that she was ready to take the path of a hero, and save the lives of those who could or would not. The first steps had been taken, and she was holding fast. Now it was time to enter the fog of confusion and uncertainty, and see if her strength would prevail. Now, for something a little more intense, it's Class 1B's resident thorny assassin, Ibara Shizaki, versus the Dark Raptor from 1A, the king of the overtime round, Fumikage Takoyami. It's girls versus boys, angel versus demon, light versus dark, flora versus fauna, and even land versus sky. She noticed the crowd seemed particularly hyped up by the words he tried that time, and she gave a small wave up at those spectating. Then she realized what he'd said during her intro. Excuse me, but what do you mean by assassin? She called up, frowning worriedly. I'm only here to claim victory, not the lives of my fellow students. Oh, sorry about that. I see you are a follower of the divine. Takoyami sighed, releasing his phantasmic companion. It seems our fate is to do battle, as is fitting. Ibara felt her whole body snap into combat alertness as she glanced back at him, turning and smiling intensely. I believe in mercy and compassion for all, no matter their sins, she proclaimed boldly. Even those who clothe themselves in the dark are worthy of love and improvement. The shadow bird gave her a pair of thumbs up, and raised its arms in claw-like fashion, while her hair readied itself in kind. Start, I guess. Ibara's vines snapped forward, bashing and snapping against Dark Shadow's fists as they clashed. She started to step forward, using some of her backup hair to anchor herself in with each step, while Takoyami remained in place. She noticed him watching her, meaning she couldn't get away with a sneak attack. Then again, she'd seen him rely almost entirely on his quirk in the first 2 rounds. Suddenly pulling free, she went all out against Dark Shadow, sprinting around in an arc as she kept the attacks at Takoyami's front. He seemed caught up in directing her, and couldn't turn fast enough to stop Ibara from getting close. She beamed at him and grabbed his shoulders, twisting and pulling him towards the edge. Her gambit paid off, as he evidently didn't think to train himself in hand-to-hand, allowing her to use the amateur move and throw him out of the ring. He didn't seem to react much, finding himself standing outside and having just lost. It seems that light truly is the greater strength. Dark Shadow meanwhile slid up to her and held out its fist for a knuckle bump. That was pretty cool. We should train sometime, she prompted, earning a smile from Ibara. We should, she agreed, gently pressing a vine to the hand alongside her own. And as for strength, light and dark are just two halves of a greater whole. The truth of strength and victory come by good and evil. Despite your motif, I believe you are still the former Takoyami. He smiled wryly at her, but it seemed good-natured enough. I'm so sorry, Yaoyorozu. Kyoka apologized again, continuing to bow as her almost but probably no longer friend got back up from the bed and prepared to return to the viewing area. The heiress held up a hand, silencing her instantly. She must be so mad right now, she'd probably never speak to her again. She'd give Kyoka that silent and hyper-formal treatment. And while it would be stunning and beautiful like everything Yaoyorozu did, it would also hurt. Kyoka noticed her glance around and prepared for a goodbye and good riddance lecture. Kyoka felt herself stiffen in surprise when instead of telling her off, Yaoyorozu gently took her shoulders and showed her that noonday bright smile. Gyro, she started, hesitating before continuing in a quieter voice. Kyoka, I don't blame you. We were both doing our best, and you managed to surprise me. You won our round fair and square. And I accepted the consequences before we even stepped into the field. Please, stop looking so down. It doesn't suit your face at all. I much prefer how pretty you look when you're happy. She thought her heart might have stopped, hearing those words, and for a moment she just stood there, a bit stunned. Yaoyorozu giggled at her, and released her with a soft squeeze. Then some idea seemed to hit her. You seem rather uncomfortable receiving compliments, she noted. Was I too forward? Yaoyorozu gasped, placing a hand over her mouth in realization. Was that why you panicked during the match? Did you think I was going to attempt to mimic Midnight Sensei and seduce you? I didn't mean to imply I was so flippant with my figure. If I came across as preparing to be sensual, I apologize for doing so, Gyro. Before she could bow, Kyoka pulled her into a hug, assuring her totally gonna be bestie's friend that she'd done nothing wrong. At least, nothing overtly. You didn't scare me that way, she said, making sure she explained things clearly. I thought your creation might expose your chest on live television, and that would have ruined your entire career. I also didn't want to be seen looking. Seen? Looking? Yaoyorozu asked, blinking in confusion. Gyro pulled back and clasped her hands behind her back, looking away and tapping her headphone jacks together nervously. I think you're really pretty, Yaoyorozu, she admitted, and sometimes I get really jealous of how you look. And not just jealous for myself, if you understand. Yaoyorozu seemed to mull the information over for a moment, before nodding to herself and tilting her head so her cheek faced Kyoka. She pointed at her ear. Could you plug in for a second? The request was so odd and out of nowhere, Kyoka was certain she'd heard wrong. I what? Plug in? Yaoyorozu repeated. Ear jacks. Could you plug one into my ear for me? WHY. Call it an experiment. I want to check something before I say anything else. Extending one of her ear attachments, Kyoka offered it up to Yaoyorozu's hands, letting her ease it in so she would be comfortable. As the rich woman gently took it in her soft fingers, Kyoka shivered at the sensations rushing up the cords. She eased the tip into her ear, letting it rest comfortably against her skin while not damaging any of the internal systems. Yaoyorozu's heartbeat rushed into her head, a little faster than usual, while her own was likely through the roof, and probably rushing through the heiress' body just the same. Yaoyorozu smiled, closing her eyes and nodding her head a little, as if listening to her favorite song. The sight made Kyoka's heart flutter a little more, before relaxing just a little. Momo seemed to notice, and smiled all the brighter, her own heart speeding up just a little. After a few moments, she gently removed the jack, but kept hold of it. She smiled at Kyoka, before suddenly seeming bashful and glancing down at her shoes. Thank you for letting me do that. I realize how personal of a request it was. And no problem, Kyoka squeaked. Did you figure out the thing you were talking about? Yaoyorozu nodded, before turning to look at her, a crimson blush across her cheeks. I really like your heartbeat. Kyoka was pretty sure she was turning into a mouse, with the sounds her throat was making. And I'd like to ask you a favor, she continued, fingering her adorable hair wisp which sat over her cheek. Could you? May I take you on an outing of some kind, in the near future? I feel as if I barely know you, but I just feel so comfortable around you. And even when you were attacking me, I felt safe, somehow, as if you couldn't harm me, even if you injured me. I would like to explore these feelings I have for you. If her heart could explode from sheer, it would have done so about a sentence and a half ago. For a few moments she didn't say anything. And Yaoyorozu evidently was going to take the worst possible implications as her face fell and she seemed to shrink. Wait, Kyoka said, waving her hands as she noticed the rather tall girl start to seem shorter than usual. I'm not saying no, I'm just really surprised. The heiress blinked and glanced back to her, a little hope still in her eyes. I guess I'm just not sure why someone as cool as you would want to be friends with me, let alone want to take me on a date, she admitted. Kyoka, I don't wish to seem rude, but that line of thinking is rather unbecoming of someone in the hero course, Yaoyorozu admonished, seeming a little like Ida for a moment. You've done so much to even get this far, and you made it to the finals of the UA Sports Festival. You're so dedicated, and I foresee you'll make a wonderful hero one day. But even if those weren't the case, I would still want to see why I enjoy being around you so much. I suppose what I mean is, I don't know why I like you either, and that's why I want to find out. Taking a step forward, Kyoka pulled her into another hug, feeling her eyes start to dampen her shoulder. I take it this is a yes, she asked, her heartbeat picking up enough to be heard even without Kyoka's jacks as she hugged back. As sure, whatever, Yao Momo. Momo giggled. Yeah Momo. I've never had a nickname before. I'm happy you gave me my first. Kyoka felt ready to die now, and with our second boxing match of the day wrapping up, Hisashi sighed, glancing over at Shoto with a look he knew very well. Young Kirishima taking the narrow win with a showing of camaraderie and chivalry at the end there. We once again turned to our resident WANA expert to ask, have you got anything to say for your kids? Shoto leaned towards his microphone with exaggerated slowness. No, really, we've had nothing but jarringly quick wins and 3 slugfests that really aren't jazzing the crowd. You didn't teach them anything about spectacle for the crowd, Hisashi complained. Showing off is more your domain, Mike. Besides, so far we've had a string of awful matchups. I mean, I wouldn't go that far. I would, Shota said, drawing the crowd's attention. We started with a match between morons who don't understand the concept of holding back, a recommendation student with range and power versus one of the more deadly close-quarter quirks, a pair of students who have probably spent so long being overlooked they've started to internalize their neutrality, a timid fighter against one who wasn't looking to win, 2 girls who have difficulty operating on their own at the best of times, and now a set of quirks that are at an equivalent stage. Any respectable hero in one of these matchups would have had to grow or do something unexpected to win in a way that had any spectacle. Aren't you the one who's always saying not to be a one-trick pony? A lesson not all of them have implemented yet. They're still relying almost entirely on their quirks, instead of developing secondary and tertiary skills. Midoriya and Shinso, for instance, were barely even boxing, while Gyro and Yaoyorozu ended up making a major mistake each and frankly choosing a winner by chance, or who could stay conscious longer. The crowd was silent, either processing, or awed, or annoyed at his words. He didn't really care. Right, well, maybe this next match will give us something more flavorful to sink our teeth into. Our next contestants were some of the MVPs of the last round, with one helping to run the overtime contest, and the other being the first to emerge with a bandana, as well as being the only person to capture 2. Uraraka. Nachako looked up from her table, rousing herself from her thoughts as she looked up at the doorway to the prep room. Deku, she beamed, seeing him wince out a smile at her, his face covered in bruises and patches. Are you okay? Did recovery girl patch you up all right? Shouldn't you be resting? I'm okay, he assured her, unable to move his arms as they were both secured in casts from not resting or taking much care of them after his odd super punches during the cavalry battle. Then, shouldn't you be watching the matches? She asked, not sure if she should be worried he wasn't talking up his usual storm. Hiroshima and Tetsutetsu are fighting. It won't change much for the next, I'd say hour, he guessed, wincing a little. She realized he was trying not to move his jaw very much, and guessed it was more injured than he wanted to admit. Smiling at his stubbornness, she patted the chair beside her. In that case, what can I do for you? He grimaced and sat down gratefully, shuffling his arms a bit to reveal the edge of one of his hero analysis notebooks. She recognized the pristine edges of a new edition, and smiled. I'm sorry to tell you, but if you're coming to give me a strategy to defeat Ida, I can't accept. Deku blinked at her. I wasn't going to, he said, a bit surprised. Actually, I was gonna say you didn't need my help, if you asked. Achako was surprised at his faith in her, and blinked at the notebook, then at him, confused why he brought it up. Uraraka, you're so much stronger than you know, he whispered, managing to get the notepad onto the table and trying to nudge the pages apart with his casts. And I don't think I've ever said how honored I am to be your friend. I was actually coming down here to ask if you'd sign my page for you. Her heart might have skipped a beat at hearing those words. She quickly pulled the notebook over and flipped through their classmates' pages until she came to the one of hers she'd seen once or twice in passing. She noticed he'd colored her costume in, as well as added a few more notes which looked like they continued on the next page. She flipped over to it, and saw a slightly different version of her outfit, along with notes of a dozen possible support items. Deciding to leave it be for the moment, she flipped back to the front where a blank line was open for a signature. She noticed it was labeled as hero name and decided to put down both. Closing the notebook, she slid it back into Deku's arms and smiled at him. I'm the one who's honored now. You said you only have like 2 other signatures in here, right? All Might's and Aizawa-sensei's. Yeah, but the last one was mostly just me taking a note he wrote and slipping it in with his analysis, Deku admitted, his usual bashful side showing off like normal. Ochako giggled and patted his shoulder. Well, one day you'll be able to get it all filled up, I bet. In fact, pros will be coming to you for autographs soon enough. A thought struck her, and Ochako leveled a finger at his face. I'll even make you a bet. If you make it to the finals, the next pro hero you meet out of school will ask for your autograph. Deku frowned in thought, before looking up at her in confusion. What are we betting with? I know you're tight on cash, so I don't want to make you pay when they don't like me. That's a good point. How about, when they ask you for you to sign, you have to buy me a good dinner, at a buffet somewhere, so I can go all out getting my week's food in one bet. And if they don't, she considered, not sure what she could really offer, especially since she'd just given him her signature. Then she remembered how flustered he got around girls sometimes. Ochako put up her best evil grin. If you win, I'll help you train to overcome a major weakness, she promised, knowing he wouldn't refuse. Deal, he expectantly agreed. Which weakness? Endurance, striking power, taking damage without falling, dodging. You'll see, she giggled. But first things first, we have to get there. Right, he cheered, his cast jostling a little as he tried to raise a fist like hers, but was stopped by the pain. He's the hero course's fastest contender. With a hunger for victory and orange juice, it's Tenya Ida. Versus, she's the master of gravity, mistress of the centrifugal force. Welcome Ochako Uraraka. As Ashi watched the two get set, stretching and preparing for their match. These two will be interesting to watch, Shota muttered, nodding to himself, along with Midoriya. These two have been some of the fastest friends I've seen in a while. I was worried Gyro and Yaoyorozu would freeze up when they fought for similar reasons, and was mostly proven wrong, but these two might hold back more. We're about to find out. Eraserhead, Hisashi roared, noticing Midnight holding up her whip. Start. The two charged one another, Uraraka standing tall and holding her hands out at either side, not unlike Bakugo's usual pride stance. Ida was sprinting right for her, his hands locked open-palmed as if intent to switch from lunging to pushing. As he neared, she leapt over his arms, managing to tag his shoulder. And with a heart-pounding opening, Uraraka is the first to land a successful hit. He screamed amongst the cheers. But it looks like Ida isn't going down so easily. Ida's engine started sputtering, not like he'd stalled, but as if he was trying controlled bursts to prevent himself from spinning like the alleged emergency exit man stunt from a few days earlier. He managed to get his body into a whirling kick, spinning towards the ground. Uraraka evaded him, able to see him building up speed and jump aside well before he got close to the ground. Still, some of the damaged concrete hit her, mostly just a few shards bouncing off her uniform, but a handful of smaller stones might have hurt. Ida dived again, and she evaded, but remained closer this time. He attacked, and she dodged. They continued the pattern, both seeming to become very tired. Well, looks like another duke out, Hisashi sighed, though really I'm not surprised. Neither of them really could win quickly after she tagged him. He can correct his flight if she throws him, but he's also forced to project a lot when he attacks. He was. Glancing back down, Hisashi realized Ida had begun to change direction at the last second, moving to actually kick Uraraka when he came down to break the ground. The crowd began to quiet, a few of them making discontented sounds as he started hurting her, unable to get her too far towards the edges before the kick's momentum threw him back upwards or away, and she could recover. It looks like Ida's losing some of the crowd support, he noted, seeing the grimace Uraraka was making even from there, and really, I'm kind of starting to sway a bit too. Didn't you say they were FR-OG? Shota had thrown an elbow in his face, leaning forward to get his microphone to full volume. Oi, all you booing out there. If any of you are pro heroes, stop watching and go home. Start job hunting, he commanded, deadly serious. And for those of you who are calling her a poor little girl, yes, I can hear you, and no, she isn't. These two are fighting this way because they're friends. They both recognize one another's strength and danger. If either of them were going any less intensely, it would be an insult. If Midoriya was in there with them, aside from probably egging them on, he'd be hitting both of them with more than everything he had. His words sank in, and Hisashi realized he wasn't exactly offering up a new opinion. A large number of the crowd seemed to be considering their challenge in the second event, which certainly supported the idea these three were a bit zealous about their goals. Regardless, it's too late. Everyone paused and blinked at the odd shade which had been cast over the ring. Looking up, they saw the dozens of small stones all hovering in a cluster over the center, still moving up, but very slowly. Uraraka placed her fingers together and leapt up at Ida. The stones began to fall, most no more than an irritant, but as they started to bounce off of Ida's back and head, and his own gravity returned, Uraraka managed to grab his arm. The sudden shift back and then from normality threw his internal ear for a loop, and his kick went wide, allowing her to swing him around and throw for all she was worth. Ida was sent spinning past the boundaries, but not quite into the wall. He breathed heavily, hovering above the grass. The crowd started to cheer, but gasped as Uraraka fell to the ground, her arms over her head. They realized why when the stones started landing on her. There was silence, as Ida prepared to guide himself back in. If he touched the ground before she was declared incapacitated, they'd have to pull a tie-breaker. But as he revved his engines a final time, there was a soft rumble. He fell to the grass, and a pair of familiar hands burst from the rubble. The audience screamed in delight as she managed to make it out, ignoring the rainbow-colored pool seeping out from under the stones. She got to her feet and managed a desperate smile, seeming to sway oddly. Uraraka wins, as Ashi screamed, much to everyone's approval. Then she fell over. That was most insightful, Tenya praised, chopping his hands as Recovery Girl helped patch up Uraraka. It was awesome, Midoriya agreed, his own batch of repair scheduled now that he'd had a chance to eat and rest for a bit. I was worried you were being too reckless by letting him get close, but then I saw the piece that you blocked go up and realized you were trying to trick him. Uraraka blushed, itching at the back of her head. It wasn't that cool, she mumbled. Plus, now I'm pretty much burnt out. I don't know if I can float much more than a pebble without my stomach giving out at this point, even with all-out training, Deku. Blushing at the admission of his help, Midoriya looked away and flexed his hands a little, likely feeling the heavy wraps around his arms restricting their movement. Tenya knew his friend well enough to guess his mood. Midoriya, I do not regret failing this day, he said, catching his friend's attention and smiling brightly. He clenched his fists and held them up, facing the ceiling. Midoriya and Uraraka lifted their own forearms to bump against his, smiling and in the former's case, wincing. You called me out in the cavalry battle and forced me to use my Recipro burst early, but in doing so I had no more tricks to hide. When we reached the tournament section, I could fight without holding back in any way. And I did. The crowd hated me for it, but I gave Uraraka no quarter or reprieve, and yet failed to her similar dedication. This is not my doing ill, but rather proving to the world that my friend has the strength to be a great hero, and that by our friendship I will be just as great. His friends smiled at him, nodding and tearing up just a bit at his emotion. Tenya grinned back, before feeling his pocket vibrate. He pulled out his phone, grinning at the ID. Tensei, pardon me, he apologized, stepping towards the door. My brother's calling, and I can't often speak with him. Midoriya, best of luck. The green-haired boy gave him a thumbs up and a nod, and Tenya tapped the accept call button. As he exited, he heard Uraraka pull out her phone and say with glee, Daddy's calling. Deku, can I take this real quick? He put it out of his mind, came the excited, but slightly electronic voice, carried as it was all the way from Hasu. No, Tenya sighed, recognizing his brother's sarcasm, but still a bit miffed at the teasing. Tensei, I did what I had to in my attempt to win. Had I tried one whit less, she would have defeated me much earlier, and I believe she's taken. I apologize for failing so spectacularly in the second event. I promise never to hold back that way again. Tenya felt himself start to tear up a little, but held back for the moment. Thank you, Tensei. How's Hasu? I heard you were on assignment there. He remembered his brother saying something about a major villain who they were busy looking for. One who didn't hurt civilians. He remembered what Midoriya had said about the villain when they'd discussed Tensei's most recent assignment. Tensei, my friend and I suspect. Are you hunting the hero killer? He cut straight to the chase, knowing he couldn't be delicate about it. The line was silent for a moment. Then Tensei sighed in resignation, the sound coming across as little more than a hiss. Tenya considered his brother's words. They didn't sound like his. They sounded vengeful, yet also full of regret. Tensei, do you remember when you told me why you wanted to be a hero? You said you thought people who worked at lost children kiosks were the coolest, because they made people in fear feel safe, and that heroes were the extension of that job. I don't think you were, Tenya said, not really believing it but desperate for his brother not to fight the hero killer. And if you were telling me the truth when you said that, then please stop hunting him. Protect the people and stay close to your friends, your sidekicks. Help them feel safe. That could change at any time. If he can kill a hero, then what civilian is going to stand a chance? Tensei went silent, before laughing softly. Swallowing, and knowing he wouldn't get any better deal out of his brother, Tenya nodded. Very well, Tensei. Tenya felt a chill run through him. But you're already ingenium. It would confuse the civilian populace, and likely fail to be approved by the Hero Association. Well, I can't imagine it will be an acquisition soon. I'll consider it. And that concludes the first round, listeners. Hazashi continued, always so enthusiastic that one. Next up, 4 battles of skill v skill. recovery girls on hand to take care of injuries, but since we can't have our participants out cold, she's only able to heal them up a little bit and has to use conventional medicine for their wounds unless they tap out. But well, I think we all know that's not gonna happen. So that means all our quarterfinalists will be going in tired and battered from the last round. Bet Midoriya, Kirishima, and Uraraka regret letting their opponents pummeling them for so long. Listeners, Nezu sipped his tea, considering and computing the thousands and hundreds of thousands of possibilities. Who would win? How would they win? He'd already been surprised once by that Midoriya boy's choice to openly challenge everyone all at once and to go on the offensive with his advantage. The odds were nearly 15,047 to 1, as his timid personality and limited control over his power would have made a more cautious action the more likely, with chance captures being marginally more likely. But, it was the Uraraka girl and the Todoroki boy. He could see the latter was restraining his power, but without the reason of self-preservation that Midoriya had in flying too fast. The stubbornness of the one conflicted with the ideals of the other, inflaming him to force the issue. In the former, human mating cycles and methods were so complex and overly layered, full of betrayals and self-denial, and not even logically arranged. Even the vaguely genetic-based actions of the elder Todoroki still failed to meet any standards of logical or rational mating. But even with that aside, the Uraraka girl was influencing Midoriya, and he, her. They'd been training together, unlike the other students who'd been going solo to prevent others from seeing what they were doing. In doing so, they'd pushed one another further than they could make themselves go. The odds said their quirk development was at least 6% ahead of the others, and their personalities might be similarly advancing. If the desire to impress was alone in the motivations, then Midoriya would be picking up some of her straightforward thinking, while she would be gathering some of his analytical nature. It followed, therefore, that his willingness to brute force situations and encourage others to defeat him by leveling the playing field was some manner of her influencing him to stick to his ideals more firmly, though sloppily, perhaps a counteraction from an abusive background. The mother was more than clean, but evidence from his middle school wasn't exactly forthcoming. Toshinori wasn't teaching the boy nearly quick enough, especially with his variance of control. Carrying Nana's quirk made him difficult to instruct. And based on how he'd acted under hypnosis, it was she who'd tapped into the true well of power during the battle, leaving Midoriya still limited to only his gliding tricks. A worrying prospect, with the Namu report having come back. If All for One was indeed still active, then the new symbol of peace would need to be prepared with haste. Midoriya needed to begin tapping into his true power now. But who could teach him to use more than one quirk? And even if he could use all 8 powers presumably contained within the quirk, he wouldn't be able to master them in any timely fashion. Though, they needed a staying action to buy time. Numbers were the issue. All for One was an unknown quantity. His numbers were variable, but his inner circle wasn't clear. At least 2, but how many more? And their own side was shrinking. Heroes were retiring, and many died to incompetent training or the hero killer. Few were graduating with the ideals and strength to hold the pro status, and not merely that of sidekicks. Merchandising revenue alone indicated the heroes the public trusted were shrinking in number. A new symbol of peace might not be enough anymore. Chapter 10, Sports Festival Arc PT. 4, Round 2. Summary. The quarterfinals hit, and things get messy. Notes. Chapter text. Midoriya v Todoroki. Anjiro v Asui. Gyro v Shizaki. Kirishima v Uraraka. The next rounds seemed particularly interesting. The challenger, and the one who'd continued to defy the call to action. The straightforward ones, yet not so plain as others believed. The ranged fighters, who'd won their battles relatively quickly. And then the two who'd taken the longest time to win, barring Midoriya's odd chivalry match at the beginning. Still, it was disappointing, seeing Toshinori's new protege only use technology and a few basic hovers. Was that his own quirk, or perhaps he was tapping into Nana's old float? He didn't know. Either way, it was depressingly limited. At one point, when purple lightning had danced over his arms, he'd been hopeful the boy had somehow tapped into One for All. But when his arms had gone limp and then his punches had shown how truly damaged he'd been left, he realized that it couldn't have been conscious and was self-damaging beyond practical use. Was Toshinori an idiot? Had he not been able to show his student how to distribute the power, to limit its release to what his body could handle? Had he even trained him long enough to survive the output, or just transferred it on a whim? So many questions, but no answers. Taking a bite of his taiyaki, he settled into his chair and watched as the loud announcer started hyping the crowd for the next match. Perhaps here the boy would show some potential. Maybe he'd throw an actual punch, or maybe kick for crying out loud. Folks, I don't think these two need any introduction. He won the first round, he blasted the second to bits, and now he's showing the bruises of victory. Izuku Midoriya versus. He froze the competition so hard we spent an hour thawing and cracking it so you in the next group didn't get frostbite. Shoto Todoroki. Shoto sighed. He couldn't keep losing like this. He'd already resorted to using his flames once, right before Bakugo had blown them all to bits, and that was once too many for his lifetime. The moment Midnight said go, he'd have to freeze with a wider range than he ever had, ensure Midoriya couldn't fly around. Luckily, he wasn't very fast, so he could afford a few seconds. Shoto blinked at the boy standing opposite to him. What was he doing? Midoriya waved at him, both of his arms wrapped in partial splints, leaving his hands, elbows, and shoulders free, but nothing else. The other boy must be insane, trying to fight with those injuries. Any blocked or offset hit would end with the bandages and tatters, and the injuries reopened. Shoto wouldn't let his career be ruined by rumors of his hitting an injured opponent for sport. He'd be precise and ensure that Midoriya would be able to get fully healed as soon as he was thawed out. Hey, Todoroki, Midoriya shouted at him. Look, I'm only able to go at half power too. It took a moment for him to realize Midoriya was doing his best to be sarcastic. He was just too earnest, and it came across more like a kid saying he was just like some fictional character because they had the same eye color. I won't be taking it easy on you, injured or not. Good. I was just gonna say that we're even now. The entire crowd let out an uwo, which irritated Shoto even more. Slamming his right foot down, Shoto blasted the widest wall of ice he could, hoping to cover the entire arena. For a moment, it appeared like he'd won, but a green blur shot by his left side at the last moment, clearing the edge of the ice. He tried to turn, but felt a familiar red boot hit him in the small of the back. He stumbled forward on top of his ice, tripping on a sharp bit and landing on his arms. And Midoriya evades the iceberg, getting in a solid kick. Out, Shoto spun on Midoriya, who was hovering just above where Shoto had been. What? I'm still in the ring, he shouted back, now embarrassed and angry. You are, Midoriya conceded, but if I'd chosen to hit you in the gut, you'd be out. Then why didn't you? Are you playing with me? Are you playing with the rest of us? Midoriya asked, his voice so earnest for an answer that Shoto was taken aback. I was only able to kick you because I know your left side's a free pass. If you'd used your fire, I would have had to go the long way around, and you'd have hit me while I turned. But because you won't, I could strafe close and even start slowing before I passed you. Growling, Shoto fired another iceberg, but forgot to make it wide. Midoriya simply leapt upwards into the sky, before dropping at him with blinding speed. It seemed faster than Midoriya had been during the cavalry battle. Shoto produced a cylindrical shield around himself, attempting to turn to catch him but preparing to miss. The purple lightning danced across Midoriya's legs, the color and shape Shoto thought he'd imagined during the cavalry battle around his arms. The kick blasted through the shield and sent him flying up his own glacier, higher and well past where the ring would be if they were on the ground. As he rounded again, he saw Midoriya's leg was limp, the pant leg ripped but still hanging over the bruised and possibly broken bones. His thigh seemed less damaged, and since he could still concentrate, his femur was probably not broken. You're shivering, Midoriya noted, his voice full of concern but also with the same tone Aizawa had when he lectured the class. You'd probably be fine for another 6 glaciers of this size normally, but with them still present and you're stuck on top of them, you're unable to warm yourself. Then again, he strained, now behind Shoto. When had he moved around to get behind him again? Was he moving faster, or had he been reacting slower? The next kick was from the left leg, and not enhanced by the lightning. You could turn on your flames and be as warm as you liked. Shoto spun in place, trying to find Midoriya. He'd vanished, but he could still hear the boy taunting him. Everyone here's giving their all, he screamed, clearly trying to reach the audience too. My team drew out everyone's best, but they all gave it. You've only tried in this festival once. If you want to win, then you'd better do it again. He put you up to this, Shoto spat, generating a pillar to get him higher so he could see where Midoriya was. Stop thinking about Endeavor for once in your life. Is Endeavor gonna fight me? Or is Shoto Todoroki? He felt himself chill at the words, and not just from the cold. Then he felt something crack. The pillar below him was more fragile than his normal ice, a side effect of his growing hypothermia. He began to fall, and tried to think of a way to land softly. A pair of arms slid under his, catching and slowing him. He turned to see Midoriya helping him land back on the glacier. I could freeze you. Right now, he managed. Midoriya only smiled, before dropping him the last foot. You could have burned me too, but I don't think you want that. Midoriya flew back up, before shouting down to him. So I think I deserve to know, what do you want? Not what you want to avoid. Not who you want to scorn. What do you want? He thought about it. It had been so long, but his dream was still there. To be a hero. No, to be a hero. Not just a pro or the best, but someone others could look up to, someone his father never could be. I want to be a hero, without using his power. He responded, raising his fist, to show the world I don't need his. You don't have his power, Midoriya screamed. You never have. It's yours. It always has been. Your power is your own. You decide who you'll become. Something snapped inside him, and suddenly there was heat. No, there was fire. Roaring in triumph below, Endeavor started shouting something. but Shoto couldn't hear the words. He didn't care, at least for that moment. "What do you want?" "I want to be a hero," he whispered. Raising a hand, he started blasting the flames around him, melting his glaciers and preparing to blast the pesky flyer out of the sky. He unleashed a wave of heat, missing Midoriya just barely as he began to circle and weave. As he continued to descend, his flames started to crack and crumble the ice, fracturing the delicate pieces and letting them fall to the ground. Before long, he was standing back on concrete, the waves of roiling energy coming off him quickly clearing the field. Midoriya was sweating, above and in the way of the heat as he was. Someone screamed Midoriya's, sounding afraid for him, and Shoto felt a pang of emptiness. No one shouted for Shoto like that. No one shouted for endeavor like that. Preparing to go all out, Shoto angled for Midoriya and let loose. Midoriya dived, his arms suddenly extended. The purple lighting sparked over his arms, catching his irises and seeming to light his grin as he pulled back for a straight punch. He wasn't going to use half strength either now. The flame obscured his vision as he fired, and for a moment he seemed to have won. But then the wind blew Shoto's fire away, and Midoriya was right there, his bandages burnt and his arms darkening in the heat and strain. Some parts seemed almost black, and the lighting around them seemed much more blue-green than purple, but Shoto couldn't be sure. Shimura-style, glacier smash. Then his chest received an impact that might have cracked his ribs, and he slid back. He erected an icy wall, managing to stop himself, but then another punch hit his stomach, and he shattered through it, skidding across the ground. He stood and prepared to retaliate blindly, but heard the snap of Midnight's whip. Todoroki out. He looked down, seeing he wasn't standing in the ring, but on the remains of ice above the grass. He'd slid past the line he'd so nicely revealed after the second punch. Glancing up, gasping for air, he felt his throat catch as he saw Deku. He was hovering less than an inch above the ground, and looked dead. His arms were both purple and black, cracked and damaged, the black and glowing portions fading away, and revealing no cooked flesh, thank Kami. His leg was still in tatters, and his chest was covered in a red not unlike that of a sunburn. Despite all that, he was grinning at Todoroki with what he could only describe as pride. It felt good to be looked at that way. Shoto felt tears in his eyes. How long had it been? Midoriya wins, Midnight quickly declared, and upon saying so, he let his quirk give out and landed on his back. He should be disqualified. I know. He won't be able to be awake for the next match, let alone win it. I know. Blast it. Toshinori, why did you let him go this far? I couldn't stop him. He's always had the drive to save everyone, regardless of his own safety. Have you considered that he might be suicidal? Recovery Girl asked, tapping Izuku's forehead, causing him to groan. I'm not. Quiet, you. You don't get to talk. Take the anesthetic so I can get to work on those arms of yours. Izuku continued to breathe into the mask, but he didn't want to sleep yet and held on. He's been throwing himself into deadly situations he knows he isn't prepared for, and been given nothing but reward for it. A quirk for trying to save his childhood bully from a villain when the pros were scared. Entrance to his dream school for smashing through a super robot to help a girl in a test where he should have known she'd be protected from permanent injury. Now, bashing his injured arms to bits against a boy who could freeze a small town with a thought. Also, he could become even stronger. Toshinori, his arms were already damaged. The bones weren't protected in any way. It's a miracle they aren't cooked when he dove into that fire. But I can't imagine he'll have full use of his fingers after this. Izuku tried to reach out, desperate to tell her he could feel and move his fingers just fine. Something moved from his skin, and he gently pushed her shoulder. Blinking, he sighed and felt the sleeping gas starting to take effect. Recovery Girl gasped as the black and blue tendrils he'd unlocked from Takoyami got her attention, before fading back into him. I won't let this keep me down, he managed, and I'm not doing this to die. I'm doing this so other people can live, not just survive. Live. Her expression softened, and she brought her cane around to smack All Might in the gut. You need to teach him better. Teach him when his body is going too far. And even if you say otherwise, I'm not convinced you don't have some deep-set death wish, she chided. How could I die when I have a promise to keep? Ingenium sighed, hearing the spoilers from the crowd around him as many of them watched the sports festival on their phones. Enigma didn't seem to mind, but then again she didn't really see much of anything most of the time. I guess Tenya picks powerful friends, he muttered to his sidekick, hearing someone scream about Midoriya. Your family tends to do that. He smiled, noticing her ever so subtle teasing in her tone. Look, if this is about Midnight wanting to spend a few weeks on patrol with us, I swear it's purely for branding purposes. Whatever you say, boss. Just don't mess up the office while we're out. Laughing to try and brush past the implications, Ingenium shook his helmet and refocused on the civilian. Technically, they were hunting the hero killer, but with his modus operandi of using the night and shadows, they were really just doing PR at this point to show they weren't scared, much like the sports festival itself. A scream pieced the air, and without even pausing to register the sound, the two sprinted towards the sound. Ingenium got there first, but Enigma wasn't far behind, expanding and taking larger steps to catch up. He skidded to a stop, sliding in between the one who'd raised the alarm and an alleyway. A figure stood there, a rough and long blade in his hands. "Enigma," Ingenium called, his armor amplifying his voice so she and the civilians could hear. "Get the citizens away from here. I'll hold him off until they're clear." "Hold me off," the man rasped, readying his sword to a quick slash position. "Shouldn't you be telling them you'll defeat me? That you'll capture me and hold the glory of defeating the hero killer?" Tensei remembered his brother's words and grinned behind his mask. "Glory can wait. Lives don't. It seems you aren't one who must be purged. Stand aside, and I will let you live, hero. Your titles and approval mean nothing to me, murderer. So long as I can hold you, you won't be leaving this place. So be it." She's sharp as a tack, blunt as a sledgehammer, and sudden as a springtime monsoon. She's Tsuyu Asui. Versus, he's the beast of the ground, and gives the middle finger to Evolution's thoughts on the tail. He's Meshuro Ajiro. "Don't go easy on me, Kiro," Tsuyu said, stretching a little. "I've got a new super move I want to try out, and it won't look cool if I beat you up while you're holding back." Ajiro laughed, giving her the thumbs up. "Sure thing, Asui. Start. I told you to call me Tsu," she shouted, dashing forward with a leap and launching a kick at him. His tail whipped up, meeting her leg and deflecting her with ease, sending Tsuyu spinning around towards the edge. She managed to grab the ground just shy of the line, sticking to it and leveraging herself around to just land inside. The audience screamed their approval of the acrobatic action. But she didn't pay them any mind. She lunged again, going for a punch this time. Ajiro met her again, but his tail was thick enough she was able to graze past instead of being knocked aside. But he was also shifting his style, and had brought his fist around to meet hers. Their knuckles knocked together, which hurt her a lot more than it probably hurt him. Leaping back, Tsuyu tried to keep some distance. She had the range, but only if she could use it. She had to attempt something first. Launching her tongue forward, she snatched him around the waist and began to twist and throw him towards the edge. His tail slammed down on her tongue, bruising the muscle a little and cutting off her leverage. She released him instantly, retracting herself and swallowing a few times to try and soothe the pain. "Not bad," he admitted, dropping into a martial arts stance. "That wasn't my super move." "Well, then let's see it." Tsuyu inhaled deeply and leapt at him again. She didn't hit him this time though. Instead, she got just barely out of range of his tail. He swung, and as he overextended, she attacked. Her tongue lanced out, but rather than rapping, she let it impact his chest. He groaned and brought his tail into a defensive stance, which she wasted no time in pummeling. Tsuyu fired her tongue out over and over, retracting it as soon as she felt it hit something and then firing it again. She could feel the bruise on the length starting to hurt, and a newer one starting to form on the tip, but she kept going, seeing the purple spot on the tail start to darken. In desperation, he swung again, and she leapt upward. A final strike of her tongue hit his waist, wrapping around him as his tail extended past where he could defend with it. She swung to knock him out of the ring, but a hand snapped out and gripped her. She squeaked in surprise as he swung her down to impact the ground inside the ring. Breathing heavily, she grinned at him. "Not bad," she returned. He held up his fists, and she got into her usual frog pose. It was time to go all out, Midoriya style. Shio sighed as she placed a kiss on the open flesh, watching it knit back together into mostly repaired skin. The bones were back together, in much better condition than she'd expected, but still damaged enough she'd had to set them just so in surgery before she could heal him. His hand carried scars now, which she couldn't and probably wouldn't have healed. He was already fighting off the sleep, now that he was repaired, which gave her only a little time to wrap him up again. She made sure to secure the hardest cast she could, securing the joints this time so he wouldn't even be tempted to use them. If she had her way, he would bow out in his next match, but she knew he wouldn't. Just like Toshinori, only more reckless, she grumbled, glad that at least his leg had been an easy fix, turning away from Midoriya as he stirred, and wishing he would just go to sleep and avoid going back out. She watched the match on her drop-down screen. Technically, Toshinori was allowed to come in now, the surgery over, but she didn't feel like giving him any favors after this. The Asui girl was laying into the Ajiro boy, her fists and feet and even tongue flying out with blinding speed as she tried to knock him out or over the edge. The tailed boy, on the other hand, was sacrificing his extra limbs solely for defense, while his hands and feet optimized openings to go for her sides. Shio sighed, seeing Midoriya's spirit in the both of them. The boy would be the death of his class if this continued. Something drastic had to be done. Midoriya groaned, trying to roll into a more comfortable position, but found himself stuck and settled back down. The poor boy couldn't even let himself rest. What exactly pushed him so far? Why wasn't he able to just take it easy? He blinked his eyes open, wincing at the pain in his arms as he tried to move them above the wrist and felt the patch job. He looked over the skin, not daring to move them. There were scars up and down the entire thing, and his fingers seemed much more crooked than he remembered. The worst were probably the 3 rings of scars which covered his palm and forearm. Each one looked like the place where his arm had been torn off and reattached. The jagged, shining skin showing the places where he'd been put back together. If nothing else, he'd be relearning how to write for a while. Some part of him realized he'd also be stunted in other areas of life. He'd never given it much thought before, but he would probably suck at holding hands now if he ever found someone to do so with. Then again, even if he did make it to becoming a hero, his devastated arm would drive off anyone who might have taken a passing interest in him, again supposing they somehow overlooked how boring he was. "You owe me an explanation, young man," she scolded, turning back to him and pointing at his scarred hand. "What possessed you to risk losing use of your most valuable tools for a single tournament match? You're lucky your fingers aren't in tatters too. I had to make sure your knuckles hadn't thrown fragments through your hand before I could heal you. And you'll likely lose some sensation in your palm." Midoriya looked at the reminder of what going overboard meant, and sighed, laying back. "I can't stay behind everyone," he whispered, a pair of tear lines appearing at either eye. "I've only had this power for a few weeks, and already I'm falling behind again. 3 quirks, and I haven't even mastered float yet. My body can't handle the stockpiling power, and the dark energy isn't even under my control. What happens if more appear? My friends are mastering 1 quirk each, and they'll start lapping me before long if I can't at least command one. But if I neglect the others, I won't be giving it my all. I won't have all the tools I need to save everyone. I'd be just like Todoroki was, holding myself back when people need me." Shio sighed exasperatedly, pulling over her cane and bopping him on the head. "You aren't the symbol of peace yet, boy," she lectured, hitting him again. "And you never will be if you end up crippled before you can graduate. I hate to do this, but I have to make sure you get it through your thick skull before it cracks too. From now on I won't heal you from injuries of this kind. Someone kicks your arm in, I'll see what I can do. But if I see you coming in with black and purple arms after a training session, you'll fall even further behind while you heal up the old-fashioned way, and not just in hero work." Midoriya nodded, sighing. "I understand, recovery girl sensei." Silently, she turned away, knowing she'd probably end up having to fix him again after a real encounter like the fiasco of the USJ, but he couldn't rely on that being possible, or he'd risk it anyways. "And another thing," she grumbled, noticing Asui's arm make a strange angle as she hit Ajiro's tail, and Ajiro's leg twist oddly as he tried to get his balance. "If your classmates start coming in with injuries like yours, I'll start refusing to heal them too. Know that it'll be on you that they're staying hurt if you push them like you did today again." She heard a pained chuckle and turned to see him grinning at the screen. "I'd rather know they all have scars up and down their limbs and had to spend months healing than see them die against a villain they could have defeated if they'd pushed just a little harder in high school. I know it sounds cold, but what good's being the new symbol of peace if everyone you love is in the ground?" Chiyo realized Midoriya was still partially anesthetized and probably was being a little more bold than he would otherwise be. Pulling around a syringe of adrenaline, she stabbed his side and injected him. He blinked, shifting back into his much more jittery self, and seemed like he was about to go on an analyzing muttering spree the likes of which would drive Nezu mad. When the pain registered, he let out a tiny sound which might have been "oh," before falling back and shivering in agony, unable to pass out. She couldn't stand it when students tried to be eloquent. "Great job, Tsu," Momo cheered, smiling over at the frog girl as she limped back into their booth. "And an excellent showing, Ajiro. You two didn't hold anything back." Tsuyu gave her the thumbs up, her tongue currently hanging from her mouth and in a loop so the spot Ajiro had smashed could be given a bandage. She took her spot beside the tailed warrior, his quirk wrapped at the center and twitching here and there as he fought not to make it sway like he usually did. He gave her his fist, which she gently met with her own, before sitting next to him. "By the way, have you seen Midoriya?" she asked, glancing over at Uraraka and Ida, who seemed worried he still wasn't back. "They said he was going into surgery, but Recovery Girl was able to tend to you both, correct?" Ajiro winced and turned to look over at her. "He was done and healed up when we saw him. His arms are wrapped up bad though, and he was shaking and staring at the ceiling the whole time we were there," Tsu managed, her voice less muffled than Momo had expected. Recovery Girl said she'd cut off his pain suppressants, but he was keeping himself awake through sheer will. Momo sighed. "That was Midoriya, all right. Well, I hope he's not expected to fight you in the semi-finals," she said, shaking her head. "I doubt he's in any condition to stand, if she's doing that to him." "Oh no, she said he wouldn't back down," Tsu clarified, wincing a little and shifting her loop of tongue to her lap. "And she offered to let me rest there too, so I could lay down and recover my strength, but Midoriya's kind of freaky looking." Nodding, Momo glanced to the empty chair beside her, where Jiro's phone was still sitting. She'd been showing her some of her favorite music, and she was quite impressed with the complexity Jiro had been able to point out to her. So many moving and shifting lines of notes, all woven together in a loud and emotional melody. But now, Now she had to wait to see how far the next match went. A versus B, folks. She's the longest lasting warrior from outside the USJ victims, and she's swept the entire competition with religious quotations. It's Ibara Shizaki versus the jamming queen. She's not just a shoo-in for the victor's slot, but a plug-in. Kyoka Gyro. Gyro stepped onto the ring, and for a moment she glanced up at their box. Momo waved tentatively, knowing the motion was too small to be seen, but wanting to show her support anyway. Still, she was nervous. The cameras caught her returning wink, and while many of the audience probably thought it was just for show, Momo felt her face grow warm with emotion at seeing it. Oh, she'd never survived the week like this. Tensing and holding her hands to her mouth, Momo watched as the vines launched across the ring, as swift and as terrible as any attack before, divine or mundane. Gyro seemed to remain calm though. Her jacks launched forward, but instead of knocking vines off course or attacking, she embedded them in the nearest tendril. Shizaki screamed, and a cluster of vines broke from her head, writhing in pain before they burst in a small explosion of chlorophyll. She held the spot where they had broken off, her expression one of surprise, pain, and apple. Frowning, she sent the vines on the attack again, only for Gyro to impale and explode more of them, her confidence in the attack allowing her to force them to break more quickly. In the vein of all the other matches thus far, Gyro isn't holding back a single iota. Shizaki seems to be returning in kind. Where did that sweet little angel go? Present Mike's words were quite correct. Shizaki's expression, which had been calm and kind up until now, had shifted into one of utter rage. Blood streamed from her scalp, while tears came from her eyes, and she sent her entire coif of hair to attack Gyro without mercy. She was being overwhelmed, only able to explode two at once, and Shizaki had enough to start entrapping her. Gyro wasn't just being entangled either. She was being squeezed, as if Shizaki had an intent to knock her out. Gyro, Momo shouted, worried for her. For Gyro. Roaring in defiance, Gyro stabbed her jacks into the vines over and over, trying to get free. Shizaki seemed to be about half out of her old amount when she suddenly froze. She fell to her knees, the blood and tears starting to flow faster. She closed her eyes and swung Gyro out of the ring, detaching a few more bits of hair as Shizaki cast her away as if in shame. Instead of cheering or holding for victory, the remaining vines swirled around to wrap around Shizaki, encasing her in a cocoon of sorts. In the moment before she was hidden from view, Momo caught her expression. It was now one of utter devastation. She couldn't believe what she'd done or had planned to do. Shizaki wins, Present Mike proclaimed, surprised at the reaction of the victor. As the robots came out to take care of them, Shizaki's bundle shuffled away, remaining closed as it slid towards the prep room. Gyro was able to jog after her, and the robots seemed a bit miffed about it. Standing up, Momo turned to run down and check on them. True, she mostly wanted to check on Gyro, but the expression on Shizaki's face, she looked like someone who needed help too. She'd become a creature of wrath, a demon of anger and evil. For that one moment, she'd given in to her family curse, and she'd moved to hurt her opponent. To restrain and to disable were acts she could take to save others, and would gladly do so. Entrapment, inflicting discomfort or pain to dissuade. These two she could handle, but in that instant, she'd squeezed Gyro with fire in her heart and meant to hurt her. How could she ever forgive herself for such weakness? Ibara heard a soft voice outside her ball. Was it Recovery Girl? Perhaps it was Midnight, come to lecture her on being an improper hero. Maybe Gyro had come to give her a piece of her mind. Peeking out, she realized it was the worst possible option of all. It was Yaoyorozu, letting her hair fall into clumps around her. Ibara surrendered herself to being berated, but Yaoyorozu didn't start to yell. She didn't even speak. Instead, a pair of arms wrapped around her shoulders, followed by a smooth pair of tendrils which she recognized as Gyro's jacks. She looked up, confused. Why are you? They didn't answer, simply hugging her tighter. She felt the tears welling up again, and managed to get her arms around them as well. I'm sorry, Ibara managed, praying with all her might that they'd be able to forgive her. I hurt you, and then I couldn't even face you. Gyro pulled back a little, and Ibara prepared for the worst again, when she heard the confused tone in her voice. Hurt me, girl, I stabbed you repeatedly and blew up your hair. You didn't start to squeeze more than a tight hug before you let go and went all mopey. Seriously, emo's really Takoyami's thing, your way too. Bright, I suppose. Ibara slid her hands down to look at them, almost expecting them to be coated in blood or ash. She hadn't hurt Gyro, as she'd feared, but she'd meant to. In that moment, when all the anger had broken free, she'd attacked with the intent to do damage, to hurt, and to inflict pain. It was unforgivable to do such heinous things to someone so forgiving. I wasn't. The results don't justify my actions, she managed, adamantly not letting herself be swayed from her self-deprecation. I meant to injure you in that moment. I won't let myself become someone who believes such an act is acceptable. I can't believe you when you say it's all right. She brought one of her remaining vines to her hand, looking at it mournfully. This power, it's a blessing and a burden. A trial I have tried to bend to the cause of helping others. With it, I can fly between buildings or catch that which should not fall. But, with a single twist, I could snap necks, or break bone, or steal from the unwary. I know who I come from, and if I allow myself to become casual about this quirk's use, I will become little more than a villain with an excuse. There was silence for a few moments, with the others likely now afraid of her. It would be as it would be. She'd been ostracized before, told religion was outdated or contemptible, feared for her dangerous powers, or simply told she looked weird. Bull. Ibarra glanced up, confused. Pardon, Bull, Gyro repeated, frowning. You got into the match, so what? Girl, you got down to business, whooped me out of action, realized you were about to go too far, and then stopped yourself in like a heartbeat. How are you not just oozing self-confidence right now? I shouldn't have been tempted to hurt someone I didn't know. Needing to stop myself was the only thing I did well. Yaoyorozu frowned at her, and she leaned away from her, worried she'd disappointed her. Shizaki, who told you that? She asked, gently. Told me. I don't have to be told, Ibarra countered, folding her arms. I've seen how my family acts when they think they're being slighted or challenged. If I let myself be as competitive or quick to anger as I could be, I won't let myself fall so far as that. Sharing a significant look with Gyro, Yaoyorozu leaned towards her a bit. She lowered her voice to a whisper, but her words were just as clear and cutting as if she shouted them. Ibarra, I don't mean to offend you, your family, or your religion, but you sound like a victim of abuse when you berate yourself. She shook her head, trying to deny the accusation. She tried to say that her parents had never done anything extreme to her, but knew that it wasn't so clear as that. She mentally amended it, that their actions had always been to teach her and to ensure she was able to think clearly, but that sounded like an excuse an abuse victim would come up with, even though she wasn't. Yaoyorozu, I don't agree with everything my parents do, she admitted. I find many of their ideas and decisions foolish. But I don't believe I've been abused. And while some of our views are controversial, my church promotes compassion and forgiveness above all else. I promise I haven't been abused. Then why are you having such a hard time forgiving yourself? Gyro prodded, one of her jacks poking her cheek. Doesn't sound like something the Big J would approve of, hating yourself over nothing. Please, don't call him that, she sighed, trying not to smile, and I fully intend on forgiving myself, once I've found a way to make it right. Made it right? What does that entail? Gyro asked, suspicion on her face and now poking both cheeks with her quirk. It mostly entails understanding what you did wrong, making amends with who you wronged, and then asking for forgiveness from them, she managed, holding it together. Okay, you got over-eager, I forgive you. That about wrapped things up. I have to ask forgiveness from everyone I harmed, Ibarra insisted, her vines quivering as she fought not to poke back. That includes, well, I need to repent to the Lord, as well as to you. Momo can make a confession booth and sit in it, Gyro offered, smirking and no doubt knowing exactly how close she was to smiling. I'm not Catholic. You're not, Yaoyorozu asked, surprised. But you always quote from biblical sources, and your favored position is of the prayerful hands. Yeah, and you call down heavenly light on a whim. Well, prayer would require I fold my arms, which would be debilitating in an emergency, she explained, a little frown on her face. She didn't summon heavenly light, did she? Besides, I quote from all my religion's scriptures when I need to. Biblical terminology's just better known. So it's a byproduct of branding? Momo asked, surprised and evidently giddy at the concept. I thought greed was a deadly sin. It's certainly a vice. Ibarra quirked a grin, giving into temptation and bringing one of her vines over to poke Gyro's head a little. But I also don't intend to become known as the homeless hero. Pretty sure Aizawa-sensei has that one locked down, but go on. Chuckling a little at the interruption, Ibarra shook her head. Regardless, I use biblical quotes and imagery so people will be able to identify me as a helper or a savior more quickly, and not someone who's simply come to capture villains and gain glory. I intend to start implementing a little more of the other facets of my beliefs when I'm better established. Perhaps help spread the word a little, but I have to be patient about such things. Gyro snapped her fingers. Right, we got off topic. We were talking about why you believed you had to wait to forgive yourself after I forgave you. Seriously, how long is this gonna take? I'm not up for spending the rest of the day cheering you up. I want to get popcorn for the final four. Gyro, Yaoyorozu sighed, shaking her head. I'm afraid repentance is a Sunday thing. Ibarra apologized. I'll be able to feel truly better then. Ugh, religion takes too long. I'd invite you to come along and enjoy the ride, but, well, you might not like me much afterwards. Some of the views I ascribe to aren't exactly seen as very modern. You believe some guy was able to beat every evil in the universe onto himself back during the Roman Empire. I don't think we'll be surprised if it's not exactly straightforward. Leaving Gyro's description of her savior as some guy aside, Ibarra shook her head. I mean, well, for instance, my church still encourages a view on personal identity and romance that were considered old-fashioned in pre-quirk days. We try to treat anyone who doesn't believe as we do with same the kindness as anyone else, but we still receive some public disdain for it. Gyro blinked at her. And you don't think we'd let you explain if we heard something contradictory like that, when you're a literal teddy bear most of the time? You'd be one of the first. Dang, now I want to go and see what kind of stuff you're doing to make a you and also get slandered by misunderstanding. Yeah, Momo, you can free up a weekend, right? I'd love to come with. We can take the set beforehand to get ready and make a day of it. Ibara shook her head, hiding a small smile and sighing to herself. Why did she have to be beset by beautiful girls who wouldn't let her mope in peace? And our last match of the round. He's the king of the ring. An arm to the teeth, Ijiro Kirishima versus the diva of Delta V, the gravity goddess, Ochako Uraraka. Do well, Uraraka. Tenya cheered, standing at the back of the Wanna box. He didn't know why, but he felt rather anxious right then. It was probably just because his friend was going into battle with someone so well acquainted with close quarters fighting, which was what she needed to act. Have they started yet? Came an exhausted voice from behind him. Tenya turned and stiffened in shock. Midoriya, he shouted, drawing the attention of the other students. Midoriya, they shouted in turn, drawing the attention of some of the other members of the crowd. Hey guys, Amadate, he managed, stepping over and leaning his casts on top of the little wall Tenya had been standing before. Midoriya, your speech is slurred beyond all reason. Tenya lectured, chopping his arms like he did when he wanted to calm himself down. Should you not be resting in the first aid room? You are unfit to stand, let alone continue in the tournament at this rate. Can't sleep, he managed, clearly slowing himself down a little. Recovery girl didn't let me. From deep within the bowels of the arena, a distant shout of Midoriya. Where are you? Echoed up, and he laughed in a manner which stated very clearly he was at least somewhat delirious. Had he been fully in control of his faculties, the sound of Recovery girl calling for him with murderous intent would be reason to cower in fear. Midoriya, I don't think we should fight in the next round, Sue managed, turning to look at him. I don't want to break your arms again, but I also don't want to get kicked in the face again. Midoriya's more serious face showed again, and he turned to nod at her respectfully. Sue, I promise not to kick you, but I will give you a match, and I won't break anything. You have my word. If you say so, I'll try and ring you out early then. They remained silent for a moment, and Tenya wondered if Midoriya had passed out mid-conversation. He seemed to still be responsive though. Midoriya, do you intend to counter-challenge? No, shaking his head at his friend's oddity. As Uraraka and Kirishima charged one another, Ida wondered if his friend would fall to blows or her stomach first. She complained that her quirk had been overused, even with her training, and hadn't indicated she was feeling better before going to prep. Uraraka's fists were closed, which indicated she wasn't planning to null his gravity. Meanwhile, Kirishima wasn't hardening. Perhaps he'd overdone his own battle with Tetsu. The two had certainly gone to the literal breaking point. Kirishima swung a straight, and Uraraka seemed to take it right in the solar plexus, her hands at her stomach. But as they impacted one another, it was the red-haired boy who went flying back. He spun through the air, head over heels as the force of his punch pushed him one way, the lack of traction preventing him from slowing as he spun away and up. Uraraka had fallen to her knees, heaving in a way which likely would have emptied her stomach if she had anything still in it. She waited only until Kirishima was at the edge of the ring before releasing him, falling to her hands and taking ragged breaths. The hardening boy tried to land inside the line, but hit the ground outside anyway. It took only a few moments, but the slow drift as her opponent had slid away was agonizingly slow and seemed to take an eternity. He half expected her to pass out and lose by default, but she seemed to hold out until the last moment. As Present Mike announced her victory, Uraraka finally sighed and slumped to her stomach. Shako, Midoriya whispered, his voice holding a flurry of emotions. Tenya was surprised a single word, a nickname at best, could contain such complexity. Pride, admiration, fear, worry, affection, and something else he couldn't place. He didn't know Midoriya was so deeply attached to Uraraka, and only after 2 or 3 weeks. Midoriya, if you feel the need to cry again today, I recommend drinking some fluids first, Tenya sighed, pointing towards the hallway down to the concession stand. And also that you do so somewhere away from the seats. Soaking unremovable cushions is a truly villainous act, after all. Yeah, Midoriya muttered, clearly not hearing a single word Tenya had said. Placing his hands on his friend's shoulders, he began to guide him back towards Recovery Girl. Hopefully they'd be able to recover somewhat before the semifinals.